Cherry Jo Bates. Born in Omaha, Nebraska on February 4, 1948, Cherry Jo Bates was a bright and popular girl. She relocated with her family to California in 1957, where she was a varsity cheerleader at Ramona High School, as well as being active in the student government and an honors student. Described as being a sweet and outgoing girl, Cherry had dreams of becoming a flight attendant when she had finished her education. She enrolled at Riverside College after graduating high school and worked part-time at Riverside National Bank. After her parents' divorce in 1965, she moved in with her father. On the morning of October 30th, 1966, Cherry and her father attended Mass together before sharing breakfast at a local restaurant. In the afternoon, she decided to go to the college library to work on a research paper. Cherry called her friend Stephanie twice, once at 3 p.m. and once at 3:45, asking whether Stephanie would like to accompany her to the library, but Stephanie declined during the second call. It's estimated that Cherry reached the library between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Although one eyewitness claims the student left her home in her distinguishable lime green Volkswagen Beetle at around 6:10 p.m. in the evening and headed in the direction of the library, closely followed by a bronze 1965 or 1966 model Oldsmobile. Cherry made it to the library and, according to witnesses, she studied until about 9 p.m. Allegedly, a young man around 19 or 20 years old was seen lurking in the shadows across from Cherry's vehicle and had been staring in the direction of her car around 9 p.m. He was described as being 5'11" and wearing dark clothing. Cherry's father waited up all night for her to return, and he even checked in with Stephanie, who confirmed that his daughter had had no plans to stay away overnight. In the morning, at 5:43 a.m., Cherry's father filed a missing persons report. Less than an hour later, at 6:28 a.m., a groundskeeper found the 18-year-old's body on the grounds of the college. Cherry was sprawled face down on the gravel path between two unoccupied houses near to the parking lot. She still wore her pale yellow long-sleeved blouse and her faded red pants. Her woven straw bag remained, and there were no signs of sexual assault or robbery. Her clothing was bloody but unmoved, and she had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest and left shoulder, with slashes to her face and neck. 10 feet away lay a cheap, paint-splattered Timex wristwatch with a 7-inch circumference. Police also found a peculiar footprint of a shoe by Leavenworth prisoners, sold solely in military outlets. From the very beginning, investigators could discern that Cherry had put up a fight, despite her tiny 5'3" frame. She had scratched the assailant's face, arms, and head, and had clearly torn off his watch. Fragments of skin and brown hair were discovered beneath her fingernails. Her autopsy showed that she had been repeatedly kicked in the head, in addition to receiving 2 wounds to her chest. The weapon was described as being 1.5 inches wide and 3.5 inches long. Cherry's death was shown to have been even more brutal when she was found to have cuts to her left cheek, upper lip, hands, and arms, and 3 slashes to her throat that had severed her jugular vein and larynx, almost decapitating the unarmed 18-year-old girl. When authorities looked at Cherry's car, they found that the ignition wiring had been deliberately pulled loose. The ignition key was in place, and both the windows were partly rolled down. 3 library books on the subject of the US government were lying in the front seat, and smeared palm prints and fingerprints were found on the vehicle. The investigation was nothing if it wasn't thorough, and an abundance of witnesses came forward, making authorities and the local community feel certain that the perpetrator of this horrific crime would see time behind bars. Within 24 hours, 75 individuals were interviewed in regards to the murder. with many of them being students at the college, and members of the nearby Air Force Base were questioned as well. By November 6th, all but 2 individuals known to have been in the college at the time of the murder had been traced and eliminated. 2 separate witnesses came forward, telling investigators of the screams they'd heard on the night of the murder coming from the direction of Terracina Drive, where Cherry was found the following morning. Utilizing this information and the expertise of the coroner, police determined that the 18-year-old was murdered around 10:15 p.m. Authorities went on to organize a reenactment of Cherry's final moments in the library, hoping that some vital evidence or witness may come of it. All participants were required to wear the exact same clothing they'd worn on October 30th, and those with cars were asked to park it in exactly the same spot as it had been on the night of the murder. 62 students were present for the staging, plus 2 librarians and 1 custodian who'd actually been in the library on the evening of the killing. Everyone was asked to stand or sit where they had been on the night in question. But while this reenactment seemed to trigger the memories of several witnesses, none could provide any successful leads. Investigators theorized that Cherry's Volkswagen had been tampered with and disabled as a ploy to lure the student from her car. The killer likely offered his assistance before attacking her in the dimly lit drive, which was partly shielded from witnesses by shrubbery. It's proposed that Cherry was forced from the vehicle to the scene of the murder while the killer stood aside or sat inside of her car. 1 month after the murder, 2 identical typewritten letters arrived at 2 separate locations. One appeared at the Riverside Police Department headquarters, whilst the other turned up at the editorial offices of Press Enterprise, a local newspaper. The author of the letters described in detail of how he had first disabled Cherry's car and then watched her attempt to start it until the battery died. He then offered his assistance, claiming his own vehicle was just down the street. Allegedly, after the 2 walked a short distance from the Volkswagen, the author said, "It's about time," to which Cherry replied, "Time for what?" only to be met with his chilling response, "About time for you to die." He then proceeded to clasp a hand over her mouth and press a knife against Cherry's neck, forcing her to the dimly lit alley where he savagely beat her before stabbing and slashing her. Since the letters included details which hadn't been released to the press, investigators believed that the author could be the true killer. However, later DNA taken from the letters did not match DNA found under Cherry's nails. On April 30th, 1967, Press Enterprise printed an update stating that both police and Cherry's father had received handwritten letters which read, "Bates had to die. There will be more." However, police considered both of these letters to be a hoax. Many theorize that the death of Cherry Jo Bates is linked to the infamous Zodiac killer, and that perhaps this was his first kill. The MO is similar to that of an attack on a couple in 1969, which was definitely carried out by the Zodiac. Further supposed proof that the Zodiac was responsible for the student slaying is a desk found in the library inscribed with a macabre poem and graphic imagery about assaults upon young women with a bladed weapon. The inscription was discovered 6 months following Cherry's death, and according to one handwriting expert, is unquestionably the same handwriting as that in the Zodiac's letters, plus the letter sent to Cherry's father. Furthermore, a letter dated in March 1971, which the Zodiac wrote to the LA Times, took credit for the murder of Cherry. Outside of the Zodiac killer, the only suspect in the case is a man referred to either as Bob or Billy, and was named as a suspect around 1968, when an informant claimed that Bob was bragging about the murder of Cherry. Cherry and Bob had attended the same school together and dated in the weeks before her death until she returned from San Francisco, where she'd gotten engaged to her steady boyfriend and broken off the courtship with Bob. Allegedly, the pair had had a public fight on campus during which Bob had struck Cherry just days before the killing. Then, on the day of the murder, Bob was playing basketball with his friends before receiving a phone call from Cherry. He then left shortly afterwards. Another friend of Bob's came forward, telling authorities that on the morning of the 31st of October, Bob was crying and told the friends he had snuffed Cherry. Bob's family confirmed he had a Timex watch similar to the one found at the crime scene, and that they never saw it again afterwards. It was also uncovered that Bob's sister worked at an Air Force base, and it's speculated she possibly gave her brother the shoes which matched the crime scene as a gift. Reportedly, witnesses saw two men at the crime scene with flashlights on the night of the murder, suggesting Bob may have had an accomplice. His best friend was questioned and failed a polygraph test. In the early 90s, he admitted he'd run into Bob at a restaurant on the night of the 30th of October, and Bob had requested a lift to campus to look for a lost item. The best friend would not admit to any knowledge about a crime when questioned, but another polygraph test suggested he was truthful, except regarding questions that might implicate himself in the murder. Despite this strong suspect, no one has ever been charged in relation to the murder of Cherry Jo Bates, and her case remains unsolved. Cherry was laid to rest on November 4th, 1966, in Crestlaw Memorial Park. Her parents and older brother were among several hundred mourners present. Suzanne Jovin. Born in West Germany on January 26, 1977, to parents who were both scientists, Suzanne Jovin was set to make her parents proud. Highly intelligent, she fiercely made her way through the tough German education system as a child and bagged herself a spot at one of America's most distinguished universities, Yale. Excelling in everything she did, as well as being musically talented, Suzanne worked as a tutor through the Yale Tutoring in Elementary Schools program, and also sang in the freshman chorus and Bach Society Orchestra. Not only this, but she co-founded the German Club and volunteered with a program which brought together students with mentally disabled adults. On December 4th, 1998, Suzanne dropped off the penultimate draft of her senior essay around 4:15 p.m. and then prepared for a pizza-making party she'd organised at Trinity Lutheran Church for the program she volunteered with. By 8:30 p.m, after helping clear up, Suzanne drove another volunteer home in the university station wagon which she had borrowed earlier that day. Around 8:45, she returned the car to the parking lot and then walked the 2 blocks back to her second-floor apartment. Just before 8:50, friends passing by Suzanne's home asked her if she wanted to go to the movies, but she declined, and by 9:02 p.m, she had logged into her Yale email account. While speaking to a friend in German, Suzanne told the friend that she'd leave some study materials for her in Suzanne's apartment building lobby, once she got them back from an unknown person. This person has never been identified, nor come forward. At 9:10 p.m, Suzanne had logged off her email. Shortly after, she headed out on foot to Yale's old campus to return the car keys to the university. And at 9:22 p.m, she bumped into a classmate who was out for a walk. In a later interview with the Yale Daily News, the classmate, Peter Stein, said, "She did not mention any plans to go anywhere or do anything else afterwards. She just said that she was very, very tired and that she was looking forward to getting to sleep." He also mentioned she was not wearing a backpack, but was holding more than one sheet of white A4 paper in her right hand. She was walking at a regular pace and didn't seem nervous or excited. Peter and Suzanne shared their encounter for about 2 to 3 minutes. It's presumed that Suzanne returned the keys around 9:25 p.m, and she was last seen about 9:25 to 9:30 by another student who was returning home from a hockey game. It's unknown if Suzanne was heading straight home or was waiting for someone when she was last seen. About 25 minutes later, a passerby called emergency services reporting a woman bleeding on the corner of Edge Hill Road, 1.9 miles from where Suzanne was last seen alive. Police were on the scene in minutes, discovering the barely alive body of the student. She had been fatally stabbed 17 times in the back of her head and neck, and her throat had been slit. The 21-year-old was lying on her stomach, with her feet on the road and her body on the grassy area between the road and the sidewalk. She was fully clothed and still wore her watch and earrings. A crumpled dollar bill was still in her pocket, and her wallet was at home. Suzanne was pronounced dead at the hospital at 10:26 p.m. Suzanne's autopsy led to the discovery of a part of the murder weapon, whose tip was found lodged inside of her skull. The remainder of the knife was never recovered. According to ABC's 2020, a news show, the medical examiner claimed that only 1 out of the 17 wounds she had suffered was fatal. The knife is described as being 4 to 5 inches in length and made of carbon steel. DNA was found under Suzanne's left fingernails, and her fingerprints were found on a bottle of Fresca, which was located in the bushes in front of where her body was left. Also on the bottle was the palm print of an unidentified person. Both of these details were kept out of the public until 2001. The only store in the vicinity of the campus that sold Fresca at that time of night was Krauser's Market on York Street, 1 block south of Suzanne's flat. The store does maintain a surveillance camera system, but police never checked it, nor did they speak with workers who were on shift that night. It is unknown why they didn't follow up this lead. Witnesses came forward as the police began their extensive investigation into what happened to the young, intelligent German American. Reportedly, a brown or tan van stopped in the road facing east, adjacent to where the body was found. This information was not made public until 2001, and although a van was impounded this same year in connection to the murder, no link was ever established between it and the student. Another alleged sighting was of a man in his 20s or 30s, described as having an athletic build, well-groomed hair, dark trousers, and a loose-fitting, greenish jacket. He apparently ran from the scene like his life depended on it, in the opposite direction from where Suzanne was murdered. This sighting was withheld for a decade as police wanted to show the witness an image of the student's thesis advisor to determine if they were who the witness had seen. He was not, and so they didn't contact her again. A sketch of the unidentified man was then released. While there were no witnesses to Suzanne's movement after the student spotted her whilst returning from hockey, it's assumed that she either entered a vehicle voluntarily or was forced inside, as the distance between where she was last seen and where she was found is too big a gap to be covered in such a small amount of time. After this, progress in Suzanne's case becomes slow and sporadic. In 2009, Suzanne's parents wrote to the governor, asking for forensic investigations to be properly carried out given how much techniques had advanced since 1998. In November that same year, results showed that the DNA beneath her fingernails was contaminated, as it matched a technician at the Connecticut State Police Forensics Lab. The main suspect in the case of Suzanne Jovin was her thesis advisor, James de Van Velde, who was publicly named as such 4 days after the murder. It took 15 months for police to admit that they had no physical evidence tying him to the case, and it seemed that the only theory investigators had was that the student was carrying out an illicit affair with her teacher. However, her friends and boyfriend disagreed with this notion. Authorities then speculated that perhaps Suzanne was unhappy with her teacher given he had criticised her paper in some way, and this had caused some sort of rift between the two. They claimed that having Van de Velde as a person of interest was not a presumptuous one, but no real motive was ever given. As a result of this bull in a china shop method, Van de Velde's career was all but destroyed. His spring 1999 classes were cancelled because his presence would be a major distraction, and his reputation was heavily tarnished. In 2001, Yale University, after a lot of pressure from several different parties, hired a private investigative team who found that no DNA or print evidence from Suzanne and the crime scene matched Van de Velde. In 2012, a group of area residents told the Jovin task force about a former Yale graduate who'd committed suicide after telling friends he was convinced he'd be imminently arrested for murder. However, the task force declined to investigate this information. The murder of Suzanne Jovin remains unsolved. It does seem that the police did not thoroughly investigate the case, and it is unknown why they chased Van de Velde as a suspect for so long, ignoring all the other evidence given to them. Now, over 2 decades after the murder, it is unlikely we will ever see justice for Suzanne. Pamela Smart. Pamela Ann Wojaz was born in Florida on August 16, 1967. She was just 19 years old when she met Gregory Smart at a New Year's Eve party in 1986, where the pair bonded over their shared love of heavy metal music. By February 1987, the couple had formed a relationship, and just 2 years later, they were married. However, cracks soon began to show in the couple's relationship, with problems arising just 7 months after they were married. Pamela met 15-year-old William Billy Flynn at a local drug awareness program, where they both volunteered. She was 22 at the time. It's unknown what conversation took place between Billy and Pamela, who bonded, like she and her husband did, over their enjoyment of heavy metal music, and entered into an affair. But, at some point, the plan was hatched. The plan to kill Gregory Smart. On May 1st, 1990, Pamela came home from work to find her house ransacked and her husband murdered in cold blood. It seemed clear from the get-go that Gregory had disturbed a robbery in progress and had been shot for it. But all was not as it seemed, and on-the-ball detectives soon found out about the affair between Pamela and Billy, and Pamela was accused of seducing the 15-year-old and threatening to withhold sex from him until he killed her husband. Billy took along friends to help him carry out his task: Patrick Randall, Vance Latime Jr., and Raymond Fowler. During the police's investigation, the father of Vance brought a .38 caliber weapon he'd found in the house to them, suspecting it could be the murder weapon. On May 14th, an anonymous tip came into the police department, which alerted them to the fact that another teenager, who volunteered at the same drug awareness program where Billy and Pamela had met, was aware of the plan. She was also friends with both Billy and Pamela, a girl named Cecilia Pierce. When police approached Cecilia, they asked her if she would wear a wire for them so they could record her conversations with Pamela Smart. Cecilia agreed. At some point over the next few months, the 22-year-old incriminated herself as the police were hoping, but details on what exactly Pamela said are unknown. On August 1st, 1990, at 1:05 p.m., Pamela Smart was arrested for the murder of her husband, Gregory. The trial of real-life femme fatale Pamela Smart garnered masses of attention from the public and the media. The teenagers who had carried out the killing on her behalf had already secured their own plea bargains and were prepared to testify against the woman who'd turned their lives around for the worst. Pamela's trial began on March 4th, 1991. She was described by the prosecutors as an evil woman bent on murder and the mastermind behind the murder plot, while the 4 teenage boys she had ensnared in her plan were portrayed as naive victims, wooed by the charms of an older woman. According to the Assistant Attorney General, Pamela seduced Billy to murder Gregory so that she could avoid a pricey divorce and collect $140,000 worth of life insurance policy money. Despite the fact that Billy was a minor, which meant their relationship was cause for concern in itself, Pamela admitted freely to the affair but denied being the one who came up with the idea to kill her husband. She claimed she had no part in the plot to murder and that Billy and his friends decided to do it when Pamela made the decision to put an end to the affair. Pamela's trial lasted 14 days and ended on March 22nd, 1991. She was found guilty of being an accomplice to murder, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit murder. She was charged for the crime of witness tampering because she tried to get Cecilia Pierce to not say anything to authorities about the plot. Pamela was sentenced to life without parole. Since her imprisonment, she has been subject to beatings from other prisoners and has alleged that she and another inmate were sexually harassed and assaulted by a corrections officer. She also tried to file a lawsuit against the prison after claiming that half-naked photos of her published in the National Enquirer in 2003 were taken by a prison guard who had raped her. Pamela has attended counselling, tutored other prisoners, and gained a master's degree from Mercy College while she has been imprisoned. Billy Flynn was sentenced to life for second-degree murder in 1992, but he was released in 2015 with lifetime parole. Patrick Randall also received lifetime parole in 2015, while the 2 other boys involved in the case were paroled in 2005. As of 2020, Pamela Smart has been denied a sentence reduction hearing. This was her second attempt to get a hearing. She is now 52 years old and continues to protest her innocence. Susan Wright. Born in Houston, Texas on April 24, 1976, Susan Lucille Weish was, by all accounts, a seemingly ordinary woman. That is, until 2003, when she became known as the blue-eyed butcher of the Houston suburbs. In 1979, Susan met Jeff Wright while she had been working as a waitress at a restaurant, and in 1998, the pair married while she was 8.5 months pregnant with the couple's first son, Bradley. Just 4 years later, in 2002, their daughter, Kaylee, was born. According to Susan, she first began to experience domestic violence and abuse at the hands of Jeff during the first few years of their marriage. He reportedly became controlling around the time of Bradley's birth. But in 2003, things escalated, and something inside of Susan seemed to snap. On January 18th, Susan admitted to her lawyer that she had killed Jeff. In turn, her attorney reported this to the police, and the then 26-year-old turned herself in. When police investigated the family home in Harris County, Texas, they were met with clues that painted an extremely grisly scene. On January 13th, 2003, Susan tied her husband, Jeff, 34 at the time, to their bed and stabbed him 193 times with 2 different knives. She then buried his body in their backyard before painting the bedroom to cover up the crime. The next day, she filed a false domestic violence report so that she could have a restraining order filed against Jeff. 4 days later, she confessed to her lawyer. Susan Wright's trial began on February 24, 2004, where she pleaded not guilty by way of self-defense. The prosecutor described Susan as a scheming wife who carried out the gruesome crime so that she could collect $200,000 in life insurance for her husband's death, while the defense argued that she had suffered physical and emotional abuse for years and was protecting both herself and her children. Reportedly, Jeff had come home from a boxing class and hit his son after attempting to get Bradley to box with him. Susan testified in her own defense, claiming that she couldn't stop stabbing Jeff because if she did, he'd grab the knife and kill her. She told the court that her husband had been on a cocaine binge and had beaten her after his encounter with Bradley. Susan's own mother, amongst others, although it is unclear who, stated that they had seen the 26-year-old covered in bruises. However, the jury did not seem to believe anything that Susan and her defense team were saying. On March 3rd, 2004, after more than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Susan was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Susan Wright spent much of the following years trying to appeal her conviction. During such an appeal in 2008, an ex-fiancé of Jeff's came forward to claim that he had been violent with her and she had endured his abuse for the entire 4-year relationship they had shared. In 2009, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a new sentencing hearing as they deemed that her counsel had proved to be ineffective during the punishment phase of the trial in 2004. The new hearing in 2010 saw some fresh evidence come to light. The prosecutor's theory that Jeff was tied to the bed was not supported by the medical examiner who dug up the body. According to them, Jeff had had so much cocaine that it hadn't all been metabolized, which supported the defense's theory that he was intoxicated that night. The medical examiner also stated that Jeff had several wounds to his hands, forearms, back, and the backs of his legs, injuries that are inconsistent with the idea that he had been tied down at the wrists and ankles to the bed. Although Jeff was found with bindings around his wrists and ankles, it's been theorized that this is how Susan maneuvered her husband to his grave, although it seems that no one truly knows with complete certainty. In an interview with Texas Monthly, Susan admitted to tying one of her husband's arms to the bed when, during the frenzied attack, her son had knocked on their bedroom door. She tied Jeff to the bed before walking Bradley back to his room. Allegedly, during the attack, Jeff had raped Susan before attempting to stab her, and so she stabbed him multiple times before he could. Reportedly, no psychologists or domestic violence experts were ever called to the stand during the 2004 trial of Susan Wright. After her new punishment hearing, Susan's sentencing was reduced from 25 years to 20 years. She was denied parole in 2014 and 2017 and is now eligible for parole once again in 2020. Catherine Knight. Catherine Mary Knight, born October 25, 1955 in New South Wales, Australia, did not have the easiest of upbringings. Her father, Ken Knight, was an alcoholic. He'd had an affair with Catherine's mother, Barbara, which had caused the family to uproot to a new town. Ken used violence and intimidation to rape Barbara, who told her daughters details of the abuse and how much she despised men. Catherine herself frequently fell victim to sexual abuse by other family members, although never by her father. This reportedly ended when she was 11 years old. During her childhood, Catherine was described as a loner who bullied smaller children. She had 2 major run-ins at school, where she had assaulted at least one boy and was injured by a teacher who had been acting in self-defense. Oddly, despite this less than savory behavior, she was still otherwise considered a good pupil. She left school at 15, still illiterate, and received her first job as a cutter in a clothing factory. 12 months later, she moved on to work at a slaughterhouse and was quickly promoted. She considered this her dream job, and was given her own set of butcher's knives, which she hung proudly above her bed. In 1973, when Catherine was 18, she met a hard-drinking co-worker by the name of David Stanford Kellett. His heavy drinking habits stemmed from the fact that he'd seen his best friend killed in front of him, and also from an accident which involved 6 dead children, where he had helped to rescue the injured and retrieve the lifeless bodies. The pair married a year later in 1974, where Catherine's mother, Barbara, told her new husband that he had a screw loose somewhere, claiming that one day her daughter would kill him. On their wedding night, Catherine attempted to strangle David as he'd fallen asleep after they'd made love 3 times. However, this was just the beginning of the turbulent, violent marriage. On one occasion, while she was heavily pregnant, Catherine burned all of his clothes and shoes before hitting David over the back of the head with a frying pan because he'd come home late. This resulted in him gaining a fractured skull, and he ran to a neighbour for help. Somehow, though, the new bride managed to talk David into dropping the charges against her. In May 1976, after the birth of the couple's first child, a daughter named Melissa, David left Catherine for another woman. The next day, as she pushed Melissa's pram down the street, she violently threw it from side to side. Witnesses who saw the incident taking place alerted authorities, and Catherine was admitted to hospital, where she was diagnosed with postnatal depression. After several weeks, she left the hospital of her own volition and then went and left Melissa, just barely 2 months old, on a railway line. Thankfully, the child was rescued. Meanwhile, Catherine stole an axe and threatened to kill several people in town, and was again arrested and taken to hospital, and, incredibly, was allowed to sign herself out the next day. Several days passed, but Catherine wasn't done with her aggressive, violent rampage. She slashed the face of a woman with a knife and demanded that she take her to Queensland to find David. The woman escaped at a service station, but when police arrived, Catherine had taken a little boy hostage. She was disarmed and, once again, admitted to hospital. When police informed David of his estranged wife's antics, he left his girlfriend and moved in with his mother so that he could support Catherine and Melissa. Catherine was released in August 1976 from the psychiatric hospital she had been staying in and was placed into the care of David and her mother-in-law. On March 6, 1980, the couple had their second child, another daughter named Natasha. 4 years later, Catherine left her first husband and returned to work at the slaughterhouse. Shortly after, she injured her back and ended up on a disability pension. She was given housing by the government that same year in 1985. Following the breakup with David, Catherine went on to have a string of affairs. David Saunders, a 38-year-old miner, was her first new partner in 1986. Catherine would often throw him out, and in 1987, she cut the throat of his dingo puppy as a demonstration of what would happen to him if he ever cheated on her. The pair had a daughter in 1988, Sarah, and then went on to put a deposit down on a house. After an argument, however, Catherine ended up hitting David in the face with an iron before stabbing him in the stomach with scissors. Understandably, David left and went into hiding when he found out that Catherine had cut up all his clothing. Upon returning to see his daughter, he found out that Catherine had been issued an apprehended violence order from the police after claiming that she was afraid of him. In 1990, Catherine was impregnated by her 43-year-old former co-worker, John Chillingworth. The pair had a son named Eric. 3 years later, however, Catherine left him for another man with whom she'd been having an affair with, John Price. Price was the same age as Catherine, and his previous marriage had ended in 1988, leaving him with 3 children. He was well liked by those who knew him and had a good reputation in the town. His youngest child, a 2-year-old daughter, remained with his ex-wife, while the older children stayed with him. Reportedly, John knew of Catherine's violent reputation as he carried out his affair with her, and even as he moved her into his home in 1995. His children liked her and their relationship was good, except for the odd, violent argument for a while. In 1998, the couple fought as John refused to marry Catherine. In retaliation, Catherine videoed items that he had stolen from work and sent the recording to his boss. Although the items were expired objects that John had salvaged from the rubbish tip, he was fired after 17 years of service. As a result, Catherine was kicked out of the family home that John shared with his children. A few months later, John restarted his relationship with Catherine, but would not let her move in. The couple's fights became more frequent, and John's friends wanted nothing to do with him while the relationship lasted. In February of 2000, things escalated extensively. Catherine stabbed John in the chest and, once again, was kicked out of the house. He got a restraining order for him and his children and told his co-workers that if he didn't show up, it was because Catherine had murdered him. Catherine showed up at John's house on the 29th, having sent his children away to a sleepover. He spent much of the evening with neighbours before returning home, which is when Catherine appeared. The pair had sex and afterwards, John fell asleep. The next day, at 6 a.m, a neighbour of John's saw his car in the drive. John did not show up to work. A co-worker was sent to check on him, and when they received no answer at the front door, they phoned police, who arrived at 8 a.m. and broke down the door to find Catherine comatose from an overdose of pills. It was found that she had stabbed her partner using a butcher's knife as he slept. When he awoke, she chased him around the house. Once he had bled out, she withdrew $1,000 from his ATM account. In total, Catherine had stabbed John at least 37 times, with many wounds rupturing his vital organs. Several hours after John's death, Catherine had skinned him and hung the flesh from a meat hook. She also decapitated him and cooked parts of his body, serving it with baked potato and various roasted vegetables, finishing this grisly meal with gravy. She put the plates in 2 table settings, one for each of the children who lived with John. Catherine Knight had every intention of feeding the children their own father. John's head was found in a pot with vegetables. It was still warm, indicating that the cooking had taken place recently. She had arranged John's remaining body with an arm over a soft drink bottle and his legs crossed. A handwritten note was left on top of a photo with him, which implied that Price was molesting one of Catherine's daughters. These accusations were found to be groundless. 2 psychiatrists claimed that Catherine suffered from a borderline personality disorder, whilst many found her to be sane, although some thought that she was suffering from amnesia or disassociation. She initially entered a plea of guilty to manslaughter, which was rejected, and so she changed her plea to guilty, although she still denies any responsibility for her actions. Catherine's trial took place on October 15th, 2001. At her sentencing, it was refused that she be excused from hearing some of the facts. She became hysterical and had to be sedated when the skinning and decapitation was described. On November 8th, 2001, Catherine's papers were marked never to be released, and she was sentenced to life imprisonment. This was the first time in Australian history that this ruling had been imposed on a woman. She has since been dubbed Cannibal Cathy and Australia's Hannibal Lecter. In 2006, Catherine appealed the life sentence, claiming it was too severe for the brutal killing she carried out. This was, understandably, refused. Strangely, Catherine Knight has adjusted well to life in prison and reportedly has a very good reputation behind bars. She is referred to as Nana and is described as being caring and maternal. She frequently knits and paints, is extremely devout, and is known for sorting disputes among inmates. Despite this, the gruesome and vile crimes she carried out will haunt the family and friends of John Price and herself forever. Georgina Garcella. Born October 29, 1987, Georgina Garcella was the middle daughter of Andrea Garcella and her ex-husband, a man named Gassem, who originally came to the United Kingdom from Libya to study. Although born in England, Georgina spent much of her childhood in Libya before the family relocated back to Britain. After falling in with the wrong crowd during her high school years, Georgina started to become unreliable, a trait she carried with her even into adulthood, as she struggled to hold down a steady job despite being described as intelligent. Family members also knew her to struggle with an eating disorder and binge drinking. Described as someone who enjoyed cooking, meditation, and going running, the 30-year-old was a loving mother of two and, at the time of her disappearance, was staying in Worthing, West Sussex with her own mother Andrea following the breakup she had with the father of her two sons. On March 7, 2018, Andrea Garcella recalled seeing her daughter before she left the house that day, straightening her hair around 8 a.m. She described her daughter as being a bit agitated that morning, as Georgina explained that her phone was playing up and she intended on taking it to a local shop to inquire about having it fixed before she headed to the job centre and then to meet her father. In the meantime, Georgina's mother gave her an old mobile phone which required a new SIM card. Georgina also asked to borrow money. Her mother was reluctant but ultimately handed over the cash, watching as her daughter left the house. Georgina was seen on CCTV in the local shop. The footage shows her asking about the mobile phone and laughing and joking with the shop attendant around 9:30 a.m. This is the last confirmed footage of the 30-year-old. After this, Georgina's movements are unknown. It took 10 days before Georgina was reported missing to the police. There was some confusion about her whereabouts, as her mother had thought she had gone to stay with friends and that her daughter wasn't speaking to her, and was annoyed with her mother due to her reluctance to hand over the money earlier that day. Around March 12th, Georgina's ex-boyfriend called her mother saying he couldn't reach her, and after asking around, Andrea Garcella found that her daughter had not been seen or heard from since March 7th. Georgina never visited the job centre, nor did she turn up to the meeting she had arranged with her father, Gassem. Police found that her phone hadn't been used to send messages since 3 a.m. on the morning of March 7th. The last time it pinged at a cell tower was between 11:30 and 11:45 a.m. in the Worthing area. Her bank account had not been touched, and despite the large number of CCTV cameras in the Worthing town centre, there exists only one other potential recording of the 30-year-old. The footage is believed to be of Georgina and shows her accompanied by another woman and carrying shopping bags. The footage is from around 3 p.m. on the same day that she went missing. The unknown woman has not been identified as of yet, and no one has come forward to name her. In October of 2018, Georgina's case was featured on Crime Watch, and Sussex police offered a £5,000 reward for information regarding her whereabouts. Law enforcement interviewed her friends, family, and ex-boyfriend. All were cleared of suspicion. They also searched her home, but found nothing to help them move forward in the investigation. But Georgina's family did not sit idly by as police carried out their inquiries. They actively made video appeals, created a Facebook page, put up flyers, and later created a reconstruction of her last known movements, trying desperately to shed light on the case of their missing loved one. A month after the mother of two went missing, on April 20th, 2018, a witness came forward, claiming to have seen a woman matching Georgina's description with two men near a Tesco supermarket on the evening of March 7th. They were allegedly in an argument, but the three of them left together, heading towards the station. CCTV footage from this area was given to police, but it had been corrupted and could not be played. Thus far in the investigation, this sighting remains unconfirmed. From this point, Georgina's case begins to grow cold. In March 2019, Andrea asked that police search the Teeville Gate construction site in Worthing, concerned that her daughter's body was dumped there, or that she had suffered some sort of accident. However, this request was refused, given that there was insufficient evidence to support any claim that Georgina was near the construction site and that something may have happened to her whilst there. A month later, the Worthing Herald and Sussex Police received a ransom note from fraudsters claiming to have Georgina in their possession. It was debunked by authorities, but the disturbing claims around the 30-year-old's case did not end there. Andrea Garcella received grim messages claiming that her daughter had been butchered and burned by a drugs gang who scattered her remains. These claims came when the missing persons Facebook page for Georgina had been hacked. Later, in 2019, authorities changed the status of Georgina's case from that of a missing person to a homicide. There is no evidence that Georgina is dead, but there is also no proof of life either. Andrea fears a number of things: that her daughter has fallen victim to sex traffickers, has been abducted, or has met a dark fate at the hands of a stranger, citing that Georgina could be, quote, too trusting. It has now been over 2 years since Georgina went missing, and a £10,000 reward is now being offered for information on her whereabouts. If you have any information pertaining to Georgina's case, you can call Crime Stoppers at 0800 555 111. Jon Jonsson. A weekend away should be fun for all involved, but for the Jonsson family, it was their worst nightmare. On Friday, February 8, 2019, Jon Jonsson arrived in Dublin, Ireland. A 41-year-old father of 4, Jon planned to attend and participate in a poker tournament that night, before his fiancée joined him the following day so they could enjoy and explore the city together over the weekend. Described as a kind, caring and level-headed man, the taxi driver, originally from Iceland, had no other friends or family in Ireland at the time of his disappearance. It is widely believed by all of those around him that he was in good mental health and had been looking forward to the trip. Jon's fiancée, Jana, arrived on February 9th around 10 AM, and after meeting Jon in their room, she headed down to the hotel bar for coffee alone. It was during this time that her fiancé left the hotel, although why is still unknown. Jon was captured on CCTV leaving the Bonington Hotel at 11:05 AM. Camera footage showed him walking past McGitton's bar at 11:07 AM, where he exited onto Swords Road. Jon was last seen at the exit of Highfield Hospital, heading northbound on Swords Road towards Collins Avenue. This CCTV footage is the last confirmed sighting of the 41-year-old. Jana reported her partner missing on February 10th, 2019, just 1 day after Jon was last seen. While police were able to locate Jon on the CCTV described, attempts to retrieve CCTV from other areas of Whitehall proved fruitless. Jon had left his passport and belongings behind at the hotel, but it was believed that he had a hotel room key card in his possession and that he had possibly even had a debit card and cash on his person. Police confirmed that Jon's bank accounts had not been touched since he left the hotel, and it's also been estimated that the father of 4 lost €4,000 in the poker tournament on February 8th. 12 members of Jon's family flew to Ireland after he was reported missing, to help the investigation and to partake in the local searches. On February 23rd, 2019, a large-scale search consisting of 80 people took place, with many of these being volunteers. The Jonsson family also appeared on the Irish TV show Crime Call, where they appealed for information to help bring Jon home. Of the 41-year-old going missing, they said, quote, "It doesn't make any sense. This isn't like Jon. He just doesn't vanish." They fear that Jon had met with foul play. There is very little else publicly known about the inquiry into the disappearance of Jon Jonsson. In December of 2019, the Johnson family hired a private investigator named Liam Brady to help supplement the police investigation. The latest update in the case came in February of 2020, when Liam Brady announced that he is hoping to speak to a person of interest in a European jail who may have information. The Johnson family continued to fly out to Ireland regularly to conduct further searches for their missing loved one. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Jon Johnson, you can email findjonindublin@gmail.com or contact Liam Brady at liam@liambradyie or call him at 086 256 6697. Leah Croucher. On February 14th, 2019, 19-year-old Leah Croucher left her home around 6 p.m, claiming she was going to visit a friend. Just 15 minutes before, she had changed the settings on her phone, with police suspecting she had turned the location setting off. Wherever she was going, Leah wanted it to be private. This became more evident when it was discovered that Leah hadn't gone to see her friend at all, and her movements between 6 to 7:30 p.m. that night are completely unknown. For some online sleuths, Leah's secret meeting was the catalyst for what transpired a day later. Leah headed out to work on February 15th, where CCTV picked her up walking down Buzzercut Lane in Fursdon, Milton Keynes, around 8:15 that morning. This is the last confirmed sighting of the 19-year-old. After Leah had been reported missing, 3 separate witnesses came forward to claim they had seen her that morning between 9:30 and 11:15 a.m. near Fursdon Lake. All 3 claimed that she was on her phone, while 2 reported that she appeared visibly upset as she talked on the mobile. These sightings have not been confirmed to definitively be Leah, but authorities suspect that these sightings are credible. Leah's family were quick to report her missing, and an extensive investigation was launched into her sudden and uncharacteristic disappearance. Officers visited over 4,000 homes in Milton Keynes, deploying specialist teams, drones, and helicopters in their search for the missing teenager. Later, in October of 2019, marine and dive teams searched the lakes across town, spending 2 weeks searching Fursdon Lake and the surrounding areas, but this turned up no items of Leah's, nor any other answers or information as to her whereabouts. Described as a homebody and a girl who enjoyed reading fantasy fiction and spending time with her family over going out to a pub or club, Leah's family opened up during the initial investigation, describing how the 19-year-old had changed in recent months. They claimed she had become moody and argumentative, and often sulked in her room for hours on end. It wasn't until the investigation was opened into her disappearance that they found out what might have been the cause of the behavior they were putting down to her simply being a teenager. It was revealed that Leah had been seeing an older man. He was around 27 years old and engaged to another woman. This man had been investigated by the police, and they have confirmed that he is currently not a suspect in the case. He has an alibi for the time that Leah went missing. Despite this, the family appear to have their suspicions about this unnamed man. Leah's older brother, Hayden, was issued with a restraining order in May of 2019 after threatening him. That same month, Hayden posted on social media that the man had groomed and mistreated his sister. In February 2020, Leah's father John said he believed a man was withholding key information about the case and accused the unnamed person of being a selfish person and that the situation was, quote, destroying his family. He added that he would publicly name the man if he does not come forward. It is not clear whether John is referring to Leah's boyfriend, but many suspect he is. Of this matter, DCI Andy Howard and the Thames Valley Police agreed that some people potentially hold more information about Leah's life than they are willing to share with police so far. However, he was less convinced about whether those people would know why she disappeared. Briefly, in May 2019, it was suspected that a severed foot found in Lincolnshire possibly belonged to Leah, but this possibility has since been ruled out. Police continue to thoroughly investigate Leah's case. An anniversary appeal this year turned up 20 new reports of information or potential sightings from various areas across the UK. The 19-year-old's phone and bank accounts have been inactive since she went missing. Meanwhile, tragedy continues to haunt the Croucher family. In November of 2019, Hayden Croucher, just 24 years old, took his own life after struggling to cope with the disappearance of his sister, whom he was very close to. If you have any information about the whereabouts of Leah Croucher, you can call Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. Merle Marie van der Heyden. Merle Marie van der Heyden appeared to be a perfectly ordinary woman. Born August 5th, 1950, little is known about Merle's upbringing, although it seems she likely experienced a regular childhood and went through her teen and young adult years without hindrance, as anything noteworthy would likely have been uncovered by this moment in time. In Maryland in 1979, aged 29, while working in the Army Intelligence Unit, Merle met colleague Francis Walsh. It didn't take long for their relationship to blossom, and in 1980, the pair tied the knot in what seemed to be a celebratory, happy occasion. Just 4 years later, on July the 4th, 1984, Merle gave birth to the couple's first child, a girl named Therese Rose. However, by this point, the relationship between Merle and her husband Francis was starting to disintegrate, and even having a child could not repair the damage or halt the inevitable split between the couple. It appeared that the marital problems between the pair were stemming from Merle's rigid rules, although it's unknown just what kind of rules these were. In 1987, Francis and Merle were clinging on to the last threads of their relationship. They moved to Hawaii, but despite their best efforts, things did not improve. In May that same year, Francis moved out and filed for divorce, and despite spending almost a decade with Merle, it appears even he did not foresee the disastrous turn of events that were about to occur. During the course of the lengthy and bitter dispute between the couple, Merle accused her soon-to-be ex-husband of sexually abusing their daughter. She could not prove this, and thus, without any evidence, her claims fell flat and made little damage to Francis's reputation or his capabilities as a parent. An investigation by a social worker and a psychologist was begun following these accusations, but they determined that Therese was being manipulated by her mother into thinking these claims were true. They also felt that if given the opportunity, Merle would take Therese away and never bring her back. Following the ugly divorce, Francis met and began dating a woman named Janice Anderson. On their first date, Merle appeared next to the car and began screaming at the pair. It's unknown how exactly she found them. Francis got out of the car, leaving his date inside, and began to speak to Merle privately, but this seemed to only fuel Merle's unbridled fury as she got in the car, sat next to Janice, and began to scream and shout obscenities at her before pulling out a stun gun and attempting to attack her. Luckily, the stun gun had very little battery power, and so the attack left Janice unharmed. However, Merle did manage to rip out the car's distributor wire, disabling the vehicle. At some point in 1988, Francis was given custody of their daughter. It was determined by officials that Merle was not allowed to see her child unsupervised until she took a mental evaluation. Following this, Merle returned to the mainland USA, and Francis seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. At last, he and his daughter would have some peace and quiet. He seems to have truly believed Merle was finally out of their lives. Francis later married Janice, providing a stable and happy home for his daughter. She seemed to blossom right before his eyes, becoming less shy and reserved as the months passed. Merle made regular phone calls, but continued to remain in the mainland USA. Then, on June the 22nd of 1990, Therese went to daycare in her home of Honolulu. In the morning, the children of the daycare headed out to recess and then returned at 12 p.m. It wasn't until the children were seated that the teacher of the class realized Therese was missing. She'd reportedly been abducted by a woman wearing a hat and dark sunglasses. Immediately, the teacher alerted Francis, who quickly had his suspicions that the woman was none other than his ex-wife, Merle. The authorities were notified, and a warrant was issued for Merle's arrest. Francis learned that Merle may have been aided by an organization called Children of the Underground, who supposedly help victims of abuse and their children escape their abuser. More specifically, they are known to help women and children escape controlling and violent husbands. The Children of the Underground are an incredibly controversial group. They have been hit with many lawsuits from angry and upset parents and critics of the program since the millennium. In one interview in 2016, the leader of the group claimed she had helped 7,000 people. The Children of the Underground is known to provide runaways with the identities of the deceased, as well as false paperwork, something which is suspected to have been the case with Merle and Therese. Despite the extensive search which followed, the mother and daughter pair have never been located, although there are unconfirmed sightings of the pair in Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Colorado, and Texas. Francis Walsh went on to found Hawaii's Missing Children's Clearinghouse and, tragically, passed away in 1998, without ever knowing what fate befell his daughter. Merle Marie Vanderheiden is wanted for abduction by both the FBI and the state of Hawaii and has been missing since June 22, 1990. She is possibly armed and dangerous, and is described as being 5 foot 5 inches tall, 120 to 145 pounds, with green eyes and brown hair. She may wear wigs and requires either eyeglasses or contact lenses. Her ears are pierced. She was 39 at the time she disappeared and would be 69 years old if still alive. She uses several aliases, which are as follows: Jacqueline Smith, Pat Doherty, Mary Jean Ham, Van Vanderheiden, Cara Johnson, and Cara Cochran. Therese was born on July 4th, 1984, and may use one or more of the several surnames that her mother uses. At the time of her disappearance, Therese was described as being blonde-haired, with hazel eyes, 3 foot tall, and 45 pounds. She was just 5 years old at the time, and, if alive, would be 35. She has pierced ears and moles on her back and shoulders, and was last seen wearing a pink t-shirt, pink shorts, and white and pink Nike trainers. If you have any information on the case of Merle and her daughter, please contact the Honolulu Police Department at 808-529-3111, or you can contact them via email on the Honolulu PD website. William Bradford Bishop, Jr. Born August 1st, 1936 in Pasadena, William Bradford Bishop Jr. is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer who has been on the run for over 40 years and remains unapprehended as of 2020 on 5 counts of first-degree murder. Bradford graduated from the prestigious Yale University in 1959 and went on to marry his high school sweetheart, Annette Weiss. The couple had 3 sons together, and the family of 5 lived in Bethesda, Maryland, together with Bradford's mother, who was in her 70s. By all accounts, the Bishops seemed like your average, everyday family, but that all changed in 1976. On March 1st of that same year, Bradford learned he would not be receiving a promotion that he had hoped to gain. He told his secretary he was feeling unwell and left his office in Foggy Bottom, a neighborhood in Washington, D.C., where he'd worked for some time. Authorities believe that upon leaving the office, Bradford drove to the bank and withdrew several $100s before heading to Montgomery Mall, where he purchased a gas can and a sledgehammer. He filled the gas can and his station wagon, then drove to his next destination, a hardware store. Here, he bought a shovel and a pitchfork. Bradford returned home somewhere between 7:30 and 8 p.m. that evening. Although no one can be certain exactly what happened that night in the Bishop household, it's believed that Bradford's wife, Annette, was murdered first. His mother was killed upon returning home from walking the family dog, and then Bradford and Annette's 3 sons met their demise as they slept, oblivious, upstairs. They were aged just 5, 10, and 14 years old. Bradford drove the bodies 275 miles in his station wagon to a densely wooded swamp about 5 miles south of Columbia, in North Carolina. There, he dug a shallow hole, dumped the bodies inside, and lit them on fire by utilizing the gasoline in his gas can he'd purchased earlier. The bodies were later found with the gas can, pitchfork, and the shovel, which were traced back to Porch's hardware store. On March the 2nd, a North Carolina forest ranger spotted smoke and discovered the gruesome scene of the half-buried, burning bodies. The only clues that could be discerned from the charred mass were the articles of clothing with the labels of an expensive department store in Bethesda, Maryland on them. Authorities found that Bradford had bought tennis shoes at a sporting goods store in Jacksonville, North Carolina that same day, while witnesses say he had the family dog with him and was possibly accompanied by a dark-skinned woman. Over a week later, on March 10th, the Bishop's neighbors seemed to realize that something was wrong. Nobody had seen them in 8 days, and, worried that something had happened, they raised the alarm. Detectives found a disturbing amount of blood in the Bishop's home, on the floor, the walls of the hall, and in the family bedrooms. The bodies that had been found earlier in North Carolina were matched against the dental records of the Bishop family, and it was confirmed. 5 out of 6 members of the family had been murdered. Another week passed, and on March 18th, the 1974 Chevy station wagon, which belonged to Bradford, was located. It had been abandoned at an isolated campground of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. The car contained dog biscuits, a bloody blanket, a shotgun, an axe, and a shaving kit, which contained Bradford's medication. At the time of the murders, Bradford was taking prescription drugs for depression and insomnia. The car trunk's spare tire was filled with blood. One witness who came forward claimed that the car had been there since the 5th or the 7th of March. Police attempted to track down Bradford's scent with the use of bloodhounds, but this failed. The following day, a grand jury indicted Bradford on 5 counts of first-degree murder and several other charges. A motive has not been established as to why Bradford massacred his own family. There are some reports that Bradford's career had caused some marital tension. He was allegedly unhappy with his desk job and wanted to go overseas, while Annette did not. She was studying art at the University of Maryland, opposing Bradford's wishes that she remain a stay-at-home mother. There are also many mixed reports on the severity of any financial issues the couple may have been having. Some say that the problems were mild and nothing unusual for people in their 30s living in that kind of neighborhood, while an article from 2013 says that the IRS was auditing Bradford's family taxes due to financial troubles, but this has never been confirmed. It has been well speculated that Bradford had intelligence training in the 1960s and that this has helped him to evade detection. Nevertheless, there have been several sightings of him across the globe which have been deemed as credible by authorities. In 2010, authorities believed that Bradford was living in Switzerland, Italy, or somewhere else in Europe, or perhaps even California in the USA. They suspected he was working as a teacher or was involved in criminal activities. That same year, it was revealed to the public that he had been corresponding with a federal prison inmate named Albert Kenneth Bankston, who had been serving his time in the US penitentiary in Marion. Bankston sent the letters to Bradford's US State Department office address, rather than to his home, but by the time authorities uncovered this lead, Bankston had already passed away, and thus he could not be questioned on the matter. However, a lead did surface in 2014, although its promise was short-lived. In 1981, a body of an unidentified man who resembled Bradford was discovered after being killed by a car while walking along an Alabama highway, and in 2014, the body was exhumed for DNA testing. However, it was soon proven that this wasn't William Bradford Bishop Jr. Some earlier leads in 2011 had been dismissed via DNA as well. Reports emerged that Bradford had died in Hong Kong or France, but these were proven to be false. In 2014, a forensic artist named Karen Taylor created an age progression sculpture to suggest what Bradford might look like at his current age, which was 77 at the time. Utilizing this sculpture, a woman named Lisa Shepard created images which showed what he would look like with the addition of facial hair and glasses. In 1976, William Bradford Bishop Jr. was 6'1" and weighed 180 pounds. He had brown hair and eyes, with a medium complexion and build. He also has a 6-inch vertical surgical scar on his lower back, and speaks French, Italian, Serbo-Croatian, and Spanish, in addition to English. If alive today, he would be 83. Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode on the murders, as did America's Most Wanted and The Hunt with John Walsh, but none of these programs seemed to turn up any credible leads. Maria Socorro de Rodriguez Lepine. Dubbed as the Black Widow, it seemed that Mexican-born Maria Socorro de Rodriguez Lepine left a trail of devastation wherever she went in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s until she finally dropped off the face of the earth in March of 1995. Maria is wanted for fraud and questioning in relation to murder. Suspected of killing 9 people, 3 husbands, 2 lovers, 2 friends, 1 funeral director, and 1 business associate, Maria can't yet be definitively linked to any of these cases due to a lack of evidence. Maria's long and chilling story began in 1970, when her first husband, Douglas Lepine, a retired military officer, died after an apparent fall in the family home, which they shared with their 3 children. Very little is known about Douglas's death, and it is unclear if he was cremated like many of Maria's alleged victims, or what other suspicious circumstances surrounded his demise. Maria then met Thomas Brixson, a retired businessman, who died of an alleged stroke in 1977, just a year into their marriage. Apparently, 6 months earlier, he had also been attacked by several intruders who broke into his home. In December of 1988, Maria met James Piper, a US businessman, and they married within 4 months. James had responded to an ad for a rental house just outside of Guadalajara, although it's unknown if Maria had been looking for a roommate, had owned the property, or was simply a neighbor. James had several children from a previous relationship, and they were all taken by Maria at first. They thought that she seemed kind and well-intentioned, and that she would be good for their father. Just 6 months later, on September 18th, 1989, James and Maria went out for breakfast together. However, James never returned from a trip to the bathroom, and when Maria sent a busboy to check on him, he found James on the floor suffering an apparent heart attack. He died a short time later. 3 days following the death of his father, James's son Peter, who had spoken to Maria when she broke the news to him, got a call from the US consulate. Peter found out that Maria had a signed document from James which stated that he should be cremated immediately. This was the first sign of trouble, as Peter thought it was extremely odd that Maria had such a thing in her possession. As far as James's children knew, he had not planned his funeral service or burial in any way, shape, or form, likely because he wasn't even old at the time of his death. Nonetheless, the children accompanied Maria to her home, accepting her invitation to have them over there for their father's memorial service. The children described this event as odd, and claimed she was trying too hard to show emotion. In a later interview, James's daughter, Tina, said, "She's pure evil. The funeral service was bizarre. She was crying, but there were no tears. It's obvious that she was not feeling anything." However, that wasn't the end of it for James's children. Maria later attempted to pit them against one another in order to get their father's possessions, including 2 cars worth $2 million. The cars have since vanished, and the children of James Piper never received any money from their father's estate. From this point on, Maria kept a low profile, and in August of 1993, she reported her half-sister as dead. She received a payout of $100,000 in life insurance policies. Then she met and began dating Victor Lapine, who bore no relation to her late husband, Douglas Lapine, who was a wealthy Montana rancher. In June of 1994, Victor's sister Eva received the shocking news that her brother was dead. Maria told her that Victor had become sick at a restaurant and had passed away a few hours later. Following the death, Maria repeated her usual trick by producing the last will and testament of her victim. She also showed a suspicious IOU for $100,000, the approximate value of Victor's home, which prompted authorities in Mexico to begin an investigation. Then, out of the blue, it appeared that Maria had died. Allegedly, she passed away in March of 1995. Her mother and 3 children received a $500,000 life insurance policy, but the insurance company, suspecting something was amiss, hired an investigator to verify whether or not Maria was truly dead. There's little information on the internet about exactly what took place during the investigation, but in January 1996, Maria's body was exhumed. What was found inside the coffin was some flowers, some wood, and a few personal belongings. Other reports claim that stacks of paper were found in the coffin instead, but all sources agree on one thing. There was no body ever in that coffin. On a hunch, the body of Maria's half-sister was also exhumed, and the same thing was discovered. There was no body, just objects inside. This is when investigators discovered that Maria didn't even have a half-sister, and that she had, in fact, fabricated the entire thing and impersonated a fictional sibling. Just a few days later, prior to the authorities questioning him, the funeral director who'd been in charge of both Maria's and her half-sister's burials turned up dead in his home. He'd been strangled to death. Maria is believed to be hiding out with her elderly mother and her 2 remaining grown children. Maria's 3rd child, a son named David, was killed in a motorbike accident. He is believed to be the only member of the family not involved with Maria's schemes. She did not attend his funeral. According to news reports, Maria's children have since been charged for aiding and abetting insurance fraud and perjury. Maria is described as being 5'2" and 120 pounds, with black hair and brown eyes. She is fluent in English, Spanish, and French, and was born on October 15th, 1939, making her 80 years old if she is still alive. She is suspected to be living somewhere in San Antonio, Texas. If you have any information on the whereabouts of Maria, please call the San Antonio Police Department on 210-207-7273. Sally McNally and Shane Stewart. 18-year-old sweethearts Sally McNally and Shane Stewart began dating in the autumn of 1987. During the couple's relationship, friends and family became concerned at their increasing interest in the occult and satanic worship, to the point that Sally's mother, Pat, attempted to confront her daughter after becoming worried about how often she snuck out late at night. However, Sally wouldn't tell her mother what was going on or where she'd been, and so Pat took to phoning the parents of a friend of her daughter's and found that Sally and Shane were involved in some kind of satanic cult. It was revealed that Sally regularly attended ritualistic parties. She took along one of her friends once, who grew upset when she saw Sally appear to enter a trance during a ritual. But it wasn't just Sally who was causing distress to those around her. Marshall, Shane's father, noticed a change in his son as well. Shane began getting into fights with other teens almost constantly, and one time was even thrown into a river during a confrontation. In January of 1988, the couple moved into their own apartment together, and in March, Sally phoned the police to tell them some of the cult members were involved in criminal activities. The pair turned a gun over to the authorities, claiming it was given to them by a member of the cult, and that they'd been told it had been used in a murder robbery. However, the investigating officer found no connection between the gun and any murders, and the serial number showed the weapon had been stolen. Shane and Sally revealed to the police that they feared the cult would harm them. 6 weeks later, the pair moved out of their joint home and left town separately. In mid-June, Sally phoned the friend she'd originally taken to the ritualistic party and told her she was afraid she and Shane would be killed. Shane and Sally reunited in 1988 to attend the annual fireworks show at Lake Nasworthy, celebrating July 4th. Before midnight, the pair was spotted by a fisherman on the shore of the lake. Another witness sighting placed the couple being approached by a pickup truck in the evening. They heard Sally tell the occupants that neither she or her boyfriend wanted to be involved in that anymore. The next day, Shane's car was found abandoned. Fast food wrappers littered the front seat, whilst the keys sat on the dashboard. The couple were reported missing on July 7th, and at first, police assumed they were just a couple of teenage runaways. It was Marshall, Shane's father, who pushed for police to investigate the foul play angle, as he firmly believed that the two 18-year-olds had fallen victim to a killer. Marshall even put forward his own suspect to the police, another teenage boy who his son specifically didn't get on with. He claimed they'd always fight if they ran into one another. Marshall went to the boy's house to question him and noticed he had scratches on his face, but the unknown boy refused to speak to Shane's father. It seems that the authorities never questioned the teen. 4 months later, the case was ruled as a homicide when the bodies of Shane and Sally were uncovered. On November 11th, Sally's skeletal body was found about 4 miles south of where the couple had been last seen, whilst Shane's were discovered 3 days later on the 14th. He was found in the same vicinity as his girlfriend. Cause of death for both teenagers was determined to be a shotgun blast to the back of the head. The trail of the killer grew cold until June of 2017, when a local man named John Cyrus Gilbreth was pulled over on suspicion of marijuana possession, and his female passenger later told authorities that he was dealing drugs, and so they obtained a search warrant for the home of the then 47-year-old man. Police were shocked when they discovered an abundance of evidence related to the 1988 murders of Shane and Sally. Audio tapes were recovered with SS written on them, as well as an assortment of notes, writings and ledgers that mentioned both victims. Also found was a lock of hair, a fingernail, and biological material that was possibly blood. Authorities later revealed that Gilbreth had been a suspect from the start of the investigation, as he was a member of the cult group the teens were mingling with. Gilbreth was 17 at the time. As of 2020, no news seems to have emerged pertaining to whether he will be charged with the murders of Sally McNally and Shane Stewart. He is currently in prison on drug and firearm offences and is certainly considered a prime suspect by police. Leroy Carter Jr. Sunday, February 8, 1981, was no ordinary day for police, called to a gruesome scene at the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. The headless body of a man, wrapped in his sleeping bag, was discovered in the park that many transients and vagrants at the time called home, to the point that tourists were generally discouraged from visiting its visually stunning grounds. Without a face, police used fingerprints to ID the body of 29-year-old African-American Leroy Carter Jr., a homeless Vietnam veteran who had a small record of petty crimes and originally hailed from Louisiana. Fortunately, since his prints were already on the system due to past offences, he was quickly identified. In the remaining stump of Leroy's neck were 2 kernels of corn stuffed inside, along with a single chicken wing. A slaughtered chicken was also found 50 yards from the crime scene, leading investigators to believe something beyond their expertise was happening in this case. Authorities determined that it was likely Leroy had been attacked whilst he was sleeping, and the cut was so clean it was suggested that a very sharp axe or machete was the murder weapon, with the head being precisely, expertly removed. However, after that, authorities felt out of their depths and turned to the cult cop, Sandy Gallant. She had become interested in cults and alternative religion after her involvement in the aftermath of the Jonestown massacre. Gallant first consulted with a Santeria expert. Santeria is an Afro-Caribbean religion that developed in Cuba among West African descendants. The two concluded that the head of Leroy had been taken to make a ritualistic brew using parts of the brain and possibly the ears and eyes. Gallant warned detectives that it was likely the head would be returned on the 42nd day it was missing, as the initial ritual took 21 days and then a further 21 days. However, despite being approached to give her opinion, most of her superiors had their doubts about Gallant's theory, with some even laughing it off entirely. As a result of the theory's dismissal, no surveillance was being carried out on the park when on the 42nd day, as Gallant predicted, the decomposing head was returned to the Golden Gate Park. Consequently, no one has ever been charged in relation to the murder of Leroy Carter Jr. Later, Gallant changed her view on what religion was linked to the killing. She no longer felt Santeria was connected, but instead, the ritual was closer to an obscure black magic cult. Regardless of her thoughts and feelings, no new progress has been made, and the case remains unsolved. Howard Green and Carol Marin. On December 15th, 1979, the bodies of a man and woman were discovered on the hard shoulder of Route 80, West Paterson, New Jersey, by a young boy walking his dog. The pair were identified as 53-year-old cab driver Howard Green and 33-year-old secretary Carol Marin, a couple who lived a quiet, mundane life in Brooklyn, New York. Wrapped in sackcloth, the pair were found to have identical injuries. Both were bludgeoned on the left side of the face and stabbed through the right eye. Even more horrifying was the fact that the two had all their blood drained from their bodies, and both had a clump of black hair in their hands. The tips of their ears had been cut off, and 30 puncture marks riddled their bodies in the exact same places as each other. Understandably unsettled by the discovery, authorities searched the ground floor flat of the couple only to find it littered with occult paraphernalia and books. It seemed Howard had been investigating the Ordo Templari Orientis, a religion started by obsessive cultist leader Aleister Crowley. Friends and family could shed no light on this, however, as when interviewed, friends told police that they last saw the couple on a New York subway train the day before, and claimed that nothing was amiss about the two. A journalist named Maury Terry was linked to the murder when he received an anonymous letter directing him towards the Ordo Templari Orientis cult and hinting that more murders were to come. It's unknown if the letter was real or a hoax, but if it was genuine, then it brought no new information or leads to the case. As far as motives went, authorities could find nothing in the personal lives of Howard and Carol. They led perfectly ordinary lives, didn't dabble in drugs, or have any history of violent exes or extramarital affairs that could provide some sort of reasoning behind the extreme brutality. An odd neighbour was identified as a person of interest. Described as a drifter who wandered around with his guitar and dog, the man used to live in the apartment above Carol and Howard. Reportedly, he described the couple as witches, although he himself seemed to have some shady pastimes when it was found that he used to catch mice in his apartment, remove their heads, and drain their blood. One detective claimed he did this for attention. When he felt someone was no longer close to him, he'd leave mouse blood on the kitchen table. The same detective, in a later interview, then said the man did it to, quote, impress a girlfriend. However, confusion soon emerged. In 2002, it was revealed that different police parties involved in the murder had no idea whose jurisdiction the case was in. Detectives from Brooklyn's 88th Precinct, West Paterson Police, and the county prosecutor's office all confirmed they thought one of the others had done the follow-up investigation. The article by the New York Post saw lots of blame shifting between the parties, and even more worryingly, told of conflicting reports on the crime between them. For starters, the man accused of removing the heads of mice was later interviewed, and he denies that he'd ever said such a thing, and even went so far as to say he never spoke to any police. He then told reporters that he had an alibi for the day of the murder, as he was hitchhiking in Texas at the time. Not only this, but it was found that detectives had several different recollections of the apartments the couple lived in. Whilst the Brooklyn investigator claims that the apartment was in disarray, littered with satanic items and blood that was found inside, the West Paterson detective disagrees, saying that there were no signs of any of these things and that the apartment was clean and tidy. Outside of this, the only brief suspect authorities had was the landlord of the flat Carol and Howard rented. The landlord admitted he wanted the pair out of the home so that he could move in his ill, elderly father. Reportedly, he had taken Howard to court over the rent paid. However, the landlord added that he had no personal vendetta against the couple and that he simply needed the ground floor apartment for his father. Due to the confusion caused by the jurisdiction between the authorities, the conflicting statements about the crime itself, and the lack of apparent motive for the brutal slaying of an ordinary, good-natured couple, the case fell cold extremely quickly. 40 years later, and the murders have still not been solved. Adam, the torso in the Thames. On September 21st, 2001, the torso of a young black male was found in the River Thames in London, England. With no head and no limbs, the child, estimated to be between 4 and 7 years of age, was dubbed Adam by police. The autopsy of Adam revealed an unnerving clue to his past when it was found that ground down plant matter particles, grain resembling sand and clay pellets, and small traces of gold were found in the boy's stomach. The plant matter was later found to be seeds, one of which was a sedative that could cause hallucinations, whilst the other was from a toxic plant that caused paralysis. This led authorities to speculate that Adam may have been alive but paralysed at the time of his murder. Further results showed Adam's throat had been slit to drain the body of blood, and his limbs and head had been removed with disturbing precision, likely from someone who had performed this kind of cuts before, and it was noted that the boy had only been in the UK for a few days before his murder. As the plants that were used on Adam were from West Africa, police theorised that he had been trafficked from Africa to the United Kingdom via Germany, a common route used by smugglers, and a theory that felt more concrete when it was discovered that the orange shorts the child wore had been sold exclusively in German Woolworths stores. Authorities speculated that Adam was perhaps made a victim of a muti killing, a practice in which mutilation and murder take place so that body parts can be used in medicines and concoctions for witchcraft. However, they struggled to find a lead, given that Adam could not be identified through British or European databases. It seemed that he either hadn't been reported missing, or, more chillingly, perhaps he wasn't even supposed to exist, and was simply used for a ritual. Thus, he had no sort of birth record, or anyone who cared for him. In 2002, officials flew to Johannesburg in Africa to attempt to identify Adam, appealing to the public for information before flying to Nigeria to try and find his parents. However, these attempts proved fruitless, and authorities returned to the UK empty-handed. One suspect in the case was a Nigerian woman named Joyce Osagid, who was arrested by police in Glasgow. Clothing similar to the shorts that Adam was dressed in was found in the flat she resided in, and it was discovered that Joyce had flown to the UK via Germany using a false passport. She even spoke to authorities about human sacrifice. Joyce was not a blood relative of Adam's, and she provided an alibi that showed she was in Germany when the murder occurred. But still, police kept Joyce in mind as a person of interest. In 2011, 10 years after Adam's discovery, Joyce was approached again and claimed to have looked after Adam as a favour to a friend in Germany. She claimed his real name was Ikpomwosa, and that she had handed him to a man named Bauer, who later told her Ikpomwosa was dead. Joyce denied any involvement in the murder, and told of how she doesn't know the group of people who killed Adam, but that they used him for a ritual in the water. Joyce showed reporters of an alleged photo of Adam, but it turned out that the image was of her friend's son, who is very much alive, and she later admitted that a misunderstanding had occurred. 2 years later, Joyce amended her earlier statements by telling BBC News that Adam's name was in fact Patrick Ereber, and he was born in Nigeria. She looked after Patrick while in Germany. Joyce also revealed that Bauer, the man whom she gave Patrick to, was actually named Kingsley Ojo, a bogus asylum seeker who first came to London in 1997. He is also a convicted people smuggler, and was deported back to Nigeria upon being arrested in the United Kingdom. Kingsley had been investigated in 2002, and found in his apartment was a mixture in a bag which resembled that which was found in Adam's stomach. He claimed that the bag didn't belong to him, nor did several other pieces of ritual-themed evidence including a video which showed an actor cutting off the head of another man, which was labelled ritual. Although charged in 2004 for human trafficking and sent to jail for 4.5 years, no solid link has been made between Kingsley and the death of Adam. Most of the theories regarding the death of Adam revolve around him being murdered in a ritual sacrifice by a religious group. Some have even thought that perhaps Adam was bred specifically for the murder, hence why he was never listed as missing and no one came forward to claim him. Online sleuths wonder if maybe Adam's parents were the ones who murdered him, which, again, would account for the distinct silence surrounding his identity. Perhaps, if he was murdered in some sort of religious ceremony, they felt it was their duty to carry out the killing. Kingsley Ojo is still considered a suspect by many, and police don't seem to have ruled him out either. He was reported to have headed a large network of other smugglers, and is thought to have snuck countless children and adults to work as slaves and prostitutes. Adam was buried in an unmarked grave in a London cemetery in December of 2006, and his funeral was attended by a small group of police and others who had worked on the case. Although it seems police finally have a possible name to put to Adam, 18 years following the death of the little boy, authorities have still failed to solve the case of who murdered him. Joanne Culliano, born January 5th, 1950, internationally renowned scholar of the history of religion, Joanne Culliano, had the world at his feet until someone took his life in 1991. Around 1 p.m. on May 21st, 1991, the body of the 41-year-old professor was found in the third-floor men's room at the University of Chicago's Swift Hall. The murder was so well executed that a student who came into the bathroom moments later didn't even see a drop of blood, but he saw the arm of the professor from under the stall and called for help. Joanne had been murdered execution style, a single bullet shot from above through the head. Investigators theorized that the murderer hid in the cubicle next to him, perching on the lid of the toilet before pulling the trigger. The murder weapon, a .25 caliber pistol, has never been recovered. At the time of the murder, campus shootings were rarer than they are today, and most were carried out by disgruntled staff and students. But Joanne was described as a well-known, well-liked, charismatic, and funny man, and authorities could find no motive as to why any student or colleague would want him dead. Joanne was also engaged to be married, with no rivals or exes to give anyone a reason to harm him. Robbery was also ruled out as a motive, as nothing had been taken from the body. At first, police wondered if Joanne's death was linked to his scholarly interest in magic and the occult, as he studied witchcraft and transmigration of the soul, among other things. He was also somewhat of a practitioner who performed tarot card readings and had a habit of making predictions that were found to be uncannily accurate. It was speculated that perhaps Joanne had come into contact with and made some dangerous enemies. At a lecture he gave in France concerning Renaissance magic, 3 self-described witches objected to his, quote, meddling in their realm. Both Joanne and his co-lecturer fell ill afterwards, and so too did several of the students present at the time. Upon the back of discovering this information, the FBI investigated whether an occult group may be responsible for the cold-blooded murder. Soon, this theory gave way to that which said Joanne's political ties were to blame for his death. A Romanian national, the professor had published several articles attacking the country's former communist government, as well as their post-communist regime. He was openly critical of both the far left and the far right political spheres. This is the most popular theory, with many speculating that the hit was carried out by intelligence agents with old communist ties. Some reports claim that Joanne had received threatening phone calls days prior to his death, and that his apartment had been broken into as well. However, the area the professor resided in was known to have a high crime rate, so this could possibly be unrelated. The only spanner in the works of this theory is that many wonder why Joanne seems to be the only person targeted of the many who criticize the politics in Romania, both past and present. Whilst the police haven't ruled out this theory, it seems that they don't truly believe it. One Reddit user attests to have information that Joanne's death was drug-related, but there is no hard evidence to support this claim, and the death of Professor Joanne Culliano remains unsolved. The Norfolk Headless Jane Doe. On August 27, 1974, a tractor driver stumbled across the body of a woman in the overgrown grass by a track leading to Brake Hill Farm in the village of Cockley Clay, England. The decomposed remains were a chilling sight, made worse by the fact that this Jane Doe was headless. Jane's hands and legs were bound to her body, and it was likely she died in either the first or second week of August 1974. She was estimated to be between the ages of 23 and 35, and was of a petite build, theorized to have stood at full height at no more than 5'2". One of the most notable clues in the case was that Jane Doe wore a pink nightgown sold in Marks & Spencer's in 1969. Another peculiar puzzle piece in the case was the plastic sheet wrapped around Jane's body. It was embossed with the National Cash Register's logo, a company known today as the NCR Corporation, who makes self-service and cash machines. A length of rope found by the body also gave investigators some important information to work with. When it was discovered, it was made with 4 strands, something which is rare, as rope is commonly made with either 3 or 5 strands. It was discovered that the rope was used for architectural machinery, and the manufacturer was traced to Dundee, but the lead died out when it was found that the firm who'd created the rope had since gone out of business. Although police went to great lengths to try and identify Jane Doe and discover what happened to her, the trail quickly grew cold. In 2008, Jane's body was exhumed, and investigators acquired new information about her from the new forensic techniques available. Isotopic analysis showed she was from Central Europe. The window was narrowed down to 4 countries: Denmark, Germany, Austria, or Italy. Authorities also discovered that Jane had likely given birth once and had consumed Scottish water for a large part of her life. BBC's Crime Watch aired an episode featuring the case, also in 2008, but few tips came from this exposure. In 2016, students at Dundee's Abertay University attempted to garner information that could help the case through old newspaper archives and missing persons reports, and while police confirmed that these attempts had shed light on new leads, they did not elaborate on what the new information was, and nothing else seems to have happened in the case since. The most popular theory in the case of the Norfolk Headless Doe is that she was a sex worker named the Duchess. This tip came as a result of the 2008 Crime Watch episode, where a former policeman pointed investigators in the direction of the escorts. It was believed that the Duchess worked around the Great Yarmouth area in the mid-1970s, and her age was somewhere between her late 20s and early 30s, which would fit the estimated age of Jane Doe. Furthermore, the Duchess is allegedly from Denmark, and most of her regular clientele were truck drivers who travelled up and down the country and often gave her lifts where she needed to go. Interestingly, the Duchess spent time in police custody, but records from this era have been destroyed, and so no real name can be given to the escort or to Jane Doe, if indeed they are one and the same. There is very little information available on what actually happened to the Duchess. It's theorized that she was in some sort of trouble, which led to her flighty lifestyle. Perhaps she was murdered by one of her clients. It could even have been a driver transporting the NCR machinery. Perhaps her head was taken to stifle identification, as the Duchess was well known, and maybe was even spotted with her killer prior to her death. Over 4 decades have passed since the discovery of the Norfolk Headless Doe, and yet her true identity still seems as elusive as ever. Even if Jane Doe is the Duchess, it seems that her true name will never be recovered. The 2018 Texas and Louisiana Jane Does. Some of the most disturbing unidentified cases to come out of the United States in 2018 were the cases of the Texas and Louisiana Jane Does that prompted fears of an unknown serial killer prowling around the 2 states. On March 1st, a prison inmate doing cleanup labor in Louisiana found the head of a woman in a grassy marsh next to Highway 27 in Cameron Parish. The head was of a Caucasian female with reddish hair and was found in a plastic bag. According to experts, the head had been there for a few months, but certainly not years, and they later narrowed down the time of death to 1 to 6 weeks before the discovery was made. In June of that same year, Louisiana police released a facial construction of Jane Doe. She was estimated to be between 30 and 50 years of age, was white or Hispanic, and had medium-length reddish-brown hair. Her DNA could not be matched to anyone on record. Jane showed no signs of trauma to the head, and she had extensive dental work, implying that she'd been looking after herself or being taken care of prior to death. Just a few weeks after the first victim was uncovered, on March 24th in Huffman, the discovery was made of another female head, also Caucasian with reddish hair, by a volunteer cleanup crew near Lake Houston. They also updated the case in June, where a sketch of the victim was released. They disclosed details of Jane Doe, such as describing her top and bottom teeth as winged or slightly rotated. She likely had naturally dark hair, as several inches of dark roots were coming through at the time of her discovery, and her eyes were light to dark brown. It was also found that her eyebrows and eyeliner had been semi or permanently tattooed on, and that her head had been in the grass for about a week. She had also been wrapped in plastic bags. One suspect in the case of both women was a man seen by witnesses throwing a plastic bag over a bridge where the head of the Lake Houston victim was later found below. He'd been spotted in the area several weeks before the first discovery was made, and had gotten out the passenger side of a bluish-green extended cab truck. The truck was described as being rusted and had been in several wrecks, with cardboard covering the missing back left passenger window. The man is described as being Caucasian, early to mid-20s, with short, dark brown hair and a long fringe. He is around 5'4" to 5'8", and was spotted around early to mid-March, about 2:30 to 3 p.m, throwing the plastic bag. A criminal investigative psychologist believes it's the same person who committed both of these crimes, and is familiar with both areas. They also suspect that the murderer has killed before, and likely has a criminal record including domestic violence and drug and alcohol abuse. Little progress has been made in the cases of the 2018 Texas and Louisiana Jane Does, and they both, to this day, remain unidentified. John Valentine Hope Doe. On February 5th, 2005, a 47-year-old woman out walking her dog stumbled across a gruesome sight that would continue to haunt her for years to come. Cecilia Davis, who worked as a nurse, discovered the body of a young boy, later dubbed John Valentine Hope Doe. At first, thinking it was a seal, she walked closer and was startled to find the headless body of a child, later thought to have been between 3 and 5 years old. John Doe had been dumped in the water and washed ashore on a sandy stretch of Rockaway Beach in Queens, New York. He was thought to be either Hispanic or Caucasian and had been wrapped up in a blanket whose fabric was printed with Disney characters, including Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, as well as letters of the alphabet. Little distinguishing information could be found on the blanket, given that it was mass-produced through the 1970s and 80s. Later examinations told investigators that John had suffered injuries such as a damaged spine and injury to his ribs, and police speculated that he had likely been forced inside of a bag, and this had resulted in the wounds. They also believed he had been tossed into the water as a means of disposal, and that John's head had come away as a consequence of remaining in the water for a long time, rather than from a purposeful decapitation. The coroner ruled the death as homicide, but it couldn't be determined what exactly the cause of death was, likely due to the decomposed state of the body. While police knew how difficult it would be to crack the case, they set up a valiant effort nonetheless, checking the National Missing Persons database for any leads and appealing to the public by distributing flyers. Still, no answers came in the case of John Valentine Hope. On May 21st, 2005, John was laid to rest. His funeral service was attended by some 200 people and was funded by both the police and the Children of Hope Foundation, who legally adopted John's body and gave him the name he was buried with. He was laid to rest in the cemetery of Holy Rood in Westbury, New York, where a triangular, glass-covered area called the Island of Hope lies. The Island of Hope is owned by the Children of Hope Foundation and is home to abandoned and nameless babies and children. Cecilia Davis, who discovered the body of John Valentine Hope, attended the funeral. She later passed away from cancer, and her sister told of how Cecilia never forgot about the little boy she found. Unable to have children herself, Cecilia would say, "How could someone be so cruel to throw away a baby like that when there's people around who can't have a child? There are a million people who would take that baby." Today, police are no further forward in identifying John Valentine Hope Doe. He, his family, and his killer remain nameless. The 2018 Halloween Doe. While Halloween is meant to be a night of fun, spooks, and scares, it's not meant to invoke any true, real-life tragedy. A head discovered in October of 2018 was actually thought to be a prank by police initially, before they saw the head for themselves and realised what had been found was something straight out of a horror film. The decaying human head was found in the backyard of an apartment complex in Oakland, San Francisco. The visiting couple who discovered it rushed it to the local police department, who were fully prepared for some sort of pretend skull. When they laid eyes on the severed head, however, they suddenly understood that this was no prank. The head had been lying in amongst a few trees in the grassless backyard of the complex, and had previously not been spotted by residents. The residents were later interviewed and dismissed as suspects from the case. It's unclear how the head became separated from the body. It may have been intentional, but investigators have suggested that it could have been moved by an animal, having naturally fallen off as a result of decomposition. The skull itself, described as having a little bit of flesh to it by authorities, did not show any signs of trauma or foul play, but this does not rule out murder as an option. It's unclear how long the head had remained in the yard. As of Halloween, authorities began looking to see if the head was connected to an almost mummified, decapitated body of a man found in close proximity that September. But there appears to be no new updates to confirm whether or not the two are of the same person. Local deputies speculate that the head and/or body were from a transient. It may be that they died from natural causes, and, as theorized previously, the head was moved by animals. The head and body were found in similar states of decomposition, which prompted authorities to speculate the link between the two, but as of 2020, this link has not been confirmed, and still, the head and body each remain unidentified. Jesse Mcbain and Patricia Mann. February the 12th, 1971 was a cold, rainy evening. Jesse Mcbain, a 19-year-old student at the North Carolina State University, was described as being a tall, good-looking man. He had met his sweetheart, Patricia Mann, back in high school, and they'd been together for 3 years and had intentions of marriage. Patricia was a 20-year-old nursing student, working and studying at Watts Hospital in Durham. On the evening in question, nothing seemed amiss. Jesse picked up Patricia, and the couple headed to the Valentine's dance, which was taking place at Watts Hospital. After the event, the pair walked back to Patricia's dormitory there at the hospital. Here, she signed out for the rest of the evening, noting that she'd be back by the 1 a.m. curfew that was in place. But Patricia never came back that night, and Jesse never returned home. It wasn't long before concerned friends and family notified police, who were reluctant to investigate the case of 2 teenagers who hadn't even been gone for 24 hours. A friend of Patricia's found Jesse's car locked, parked up at a lover's lane at what is now the Hillendale Golf Course on Medford Road. It was undisturbed and had 2 coats lying across the back seats. Those who knew the couple were alarmed, as both were happy and looking forward to their future together, and were not the type to run away. On February the 25th, almost 2 weeks after the pair vanished, a surveyor working in the woods thought he'd found a mannequin's leg on a 1-track dirt road in Orange County. Beneath the pile of leaves, however, the worker found something much more disturbing: the deceased bodies of a young man and a young woman. Jesse Mcbain and Patricia Mann were identified as the victims. They were both still fully dressed, their hands tied behind their backs to a tree with thick ropes. Though the ropes were stretched tight and knotted around their necks, their upper bodies had slumped over so that they lay side by side. The medical examiner who performed autopsies on the bodies identified several distinct strangle marks on the necks of both victims, which made it appear as if the pair had each had a rope tightened around their necks, loosened, and then tightened again, as a means of torture. The couple had suffered almost identical injuries, except Patricia had a half-inch tear to her liver, meaning she had received a violent blow to her stomach before she died. The sheriff's offices of both Orange County and Durham County worked together with the Durham Police Department and the State Bureau of Investigation to try and find the perpetrator of these brutal, sadistic crimes. But the case became confused and its waters muddied due to the lack of communication between the 4 agencies who were working on it. Despite this, 2 suspects were identified in the 1970s. They continue to be suspects still, although only one is alive today. Little is known on what makes these 2 people persons of interest, and the case of Jesse Mcbain and Patricia Mann is kept heavily under wraps by authorities. Investigator Tim Horn declined to say how or why the man became a suspect when later questioned. Reportedly, the suspect had declined to take a polygraph test in 1971, and again in a recent investigation when he was asked once more. He also declined to give a DNA sample, although authorities later collected one from a public place. Recent reports and online sleuths have found that the man in question is a former doctor of Watts Hospital, where Patricia worked and studied. Tim Horn has confirmed that as far as authorities are aware, this man was not a love interest in Patricia's life. The killer is believed to be somebody who is familiar with the area, as he had to have felt comfortable no one would discover him and his victims as they screamed and pleaded with him whilst enduring the torture he inflicted upon them. At one point, after the 1970s, the case was closed. But in 2011, after Tim Horn found a box of discarded evidence and was on duty the day Patricia's cousin phoned in to ask about progress in the case, he worked with her to petition to have the case reopened, and the sheriff agreed. In recent updates to the case, it has been confirmed that a DNA test performed on the rope sadly failed to gather any useful evidence. The media coverage that resulted from forensics being performed on evidence that was almost 5 decades old prompted a retired detective who alerted investigators to a similar case that occurred in 1972. A couple on a lover's lane was approached by a man who forced them both into his car trunk by gunpoint. They were driven to Orange County, but the pair managed to escape. Although investigators set up interviews to try and find a link between the two cases, nothing has publicly come of this line of investigation. Although authorities continue to work hard on the case of Jesse Mcbain and Patricia Mann, their cases continue to go unsolved. As always, we ask if you have any information to please relate it to the relevant sources. In this case, contact North Carolina Sheriff's Association on 919-644-3050. Brian and Angela Charles. It is March 22nd, 2009, around 7 a.m, and police are called to a violent scene on a quiet street in Joliet, Illinois. 31-year-old IT manager Brian Charles is found slumped from the living room couch in the home he shares with his wife and the couple's 2-year-old child. Brian has been shot in the head and the chest. Angela Charles, 23, a portrait photographer at Orland Park's JCPenney, is found dead from a shot to the head in the hallway outside of their child's bedroom. Their 2-year-old, Sean, sleeps in his wooden crib. The call to emergency services was made by Brian's ex-wife, Kathleen, a 31-year-old who was the mother of Brian's other 2 children. Kathleen had gone to Charles's house to collect video games for her children, a notion that was contradicted by her children, according to an investigator's affidavit. Family and friends also dispute this reasoning, claiming that Kathleen didn't even let her children play video games. Many online sleuths have wondered why on earth one would head to their ex-husband's house at 7 a.m. simply to collect some games. Kathleen quickly became the prime suspect in the cold-blooded murder of her ex-husband and his new wife, as details of their ugly divorce and bitter custody battle came to light. Brian and Kathleen had been married for 7 years, in which Brian took his wife's last name. He filed for divorce in 2003 and was granted temporary custody of the children. 3 years later, Brian married Angela, and Sean was born the following year. Brian was known for his kind and generous nature, his talent as an artist, and his belly laugh, and he often played Pokemon cards with his kids. Angela was a hard-working woman with a passion for photography, who intended to go back to college and transfer to university as soon as she could. She was also a Girl Scout leader. 10 days before her murder, she had gotten the names of her and Brian's child and her stepchildren, Cora and Liam, tattooed onto her body. In 2008, Brian was awarded custody of his other children. As Michigan Family Service workers opened an investigation into the living conditions of the mobile home, in which Kathleen lived. According to Brian, the children had no running water, shared bug-infested cereal with the family dog, and used buckets as toilets. He went on to add that rags were used instead of toilet paper, and these said rags would then continue to lie on the floor afterwards, and that his children hadn't been bathed in weeks. He even added that one was made to beg at garage sales. On the other hand, Kathleen alleged that Brian had been abusing her and the children. Brian received no criminal convictions from this, but Kathleen managed to secure a pair of protective orders. One lasted around 6 weeks, while another was dismissed after only 3 weeks. After Brian's allegations arose and the investigators tried to inspect her home, Kathleen fled the state with her children. A judge proceeded to order that the children not be taken outside of the county without the court's permission, and set a trial date for March 30th, 2009. When investigators looked through Angela's Facebook account, they noted her many distressed and upset posts in regards to the custody battle she and Brian were ensnared in with his ex-wife. 2 days after the murders, investigators issued a search warrant at Kathleen's home. They searched her 1990 Chevrolet station wagon and seized 8 computers along with other materials. She was interviewed for 12 hours following the slayings and spent most of the investigation declining to cooperate. She hired an attorney and moved to California with Liam and Cora, whom she was given custody of 10 days after the murders. Kathleen's attorney claimed she had nothing to do with the crime, but refused to comment any further. Relatives and friends claimed that Angela and Brian had voiced their concerns for their safety in the weeks leading up to the murders. It was also found that the back of the Charles family home was broken into when the family were attending the couple's funeral on March 7th. A back window was smashed, but this was later established as being neighborhood kids who knew the house was empty, who had broken in to steal the games console and DVDs. Kathleen did not attend the funeral after being asked by family and friends. Angela's parents, Jackie and Joseph Roth, now care for Sean, who frequently asks about his parents. In later reports, it appears that Kathleen lost custody of her children, and Cora and Liam went on to be raised by Brian's parents. The only witnesses in the couple's case is that of the neighbours who claim to have heard loud noises around 2 to 2:30 a.m. Another neighbour saw 2 men standing outside the front of the home at about 1 in the morning. These men have never been traced. While many believe Kathleen played a hand in the murder of her ex-husband and his new wife, she has yet to face any charges. It seems there isn't enough evidence to pursue this line of inquiry or bring charges. As a result, the case of Brian and Angela Charles continues to grow cold. If you have any information, please contact the Will County Sheriff Office at 815-727-8575. Harvey and Jeanette Crew. David Harvey Crew, 28, and Jeanette Lenore Crew, 30, were a farming couple who resided in Pukekohe, New Zealand, and were murdered in 1970. The pair had married just 4 years earlier on June 18, 1966 in Auckland, and, at the time of their deaths, had an 18-month-old daughter. In the months leading up to the murder, the pair was subject to several arson attacks and a burglary. In one of these cases, clothing was set fire to in the bedroom. The bizarre and seemingly random acts of violence caused Jeanette to become afraid of staying in her home and with her daughter when Harvey wasn't there. No one was ever apprehended for these crimes. On June 22, 1970, the phone in the farmhouse belonging to the couple went unanswered. No one had picked up in days. The Crews lived near to Jeanette's father, Leonard W. Delmer, his farm adjoining theirs. And so a stock agent called Leonard to check to see if Harvey still wanted trucks to pick up sheep, as he couldn't get through to either half of the couple. When Leonard arrived at the pair's house, he found bloodstains in the farmhouse, and their 18-month-old daughter upset in her crib. She looked thin, as if she'd lost a few pounds, and her parents were nowhere to be seen. Instead of immediately alerting emergency services, however, Leonard went back to his own home to phone the agent and tell him to cancel the trucks. He then took a neighbour with him, one who had alerted Leonard to the fact that no one had heard from his daughter and son-in-law for a while, before he returned to the house. The child was handed over to a neighbour to be cared for, and the authorities were called. Jeanette and Harvey had last been seen on the 17th of June. The couple's milk, bread, and paper deliveries hadn't been collected from their letterbox, and it was found that their daughter likely hadn't eaten in 5 days. It was believed she hadn't had anything to drink in at most 48 hours. Oddly, a witness who came forward, another neighbour, claimed that a woman he didn't recognise was on the property on the 19th. He was very familiar with the crews and was confident it wasn't Jeanette, who had long, dark hair. The woman he had seen had fair hair. Months later, on August 16th, Jeanette's body was found. It was wrapped in a duvet and bound with copper wire, and had been located in the Wicator River. Harvey's body was found a month later, on September 16th, further upriver. It appeared to have been caught on some reeds. A car axle was found with the body, as if the killer had attempted to weigh it down, but only one investigator claimed that it was with the body, whilst others could not verify this. It could have simply been underneath the body in the water. Many theories arose in later years, which included the notion that this clue was false, and the axle wasn't even attached to the body at all. Both Jeanette and Harvey had been shot to death with a .22 caliber weapon. Jeanette also had broken facial bones from being struck with a blunt object. On the couple's Wikipedia page, it's mentioned that Jeanette was sexually assaulted, but many other reports do not include this information. 64 registered .22 caliber guns from locals and neighbours were collected and test fired. A forensic report on August 19, 1970 stated that of those tested, neither the rifle of a man named Arthur Allen Thomas nor the rifle of local family named the Eyre family could be ruled out, but insufficient evidence pointed to either. The axle found with the body of Harvey was connected to Arthur Allen Thomas, a neighbouring farmer. It was believed to have come from a trailer which had sold in 1959 to Arthur's father, Allen Thomas, and had resided on his farm, which Arthur was now running. 2 back axles for the trailer were found in one of the tips on the property. Police also matched the copper wire which bound the bodies to some which was found on Arthur's farm. Whilst much of the evidence was circumstantial, police continued to pursue Arthur as their main suspect. In June of 1970, when Jeanette's sister Heather arrived from the United States to care for their daughter, she pointed the finger at Arthur, whose name had been raised earlier in the investigation by someone who claimed Jeanette had been pestered by a local boy prior to 1961. Upon being asked, Arthur told authorities that while he had liked Jeanette when they were younger and that he had chased after her romantically, she did not seem to reciprocate these feelings and never showed any interest, and so he moved on. He had been married to his wife for 3 years and claimed that he hadn't seen either Harvey or Jeanette in 8 or 9 months. Prior to Jeanette getting married, Arthur had encountered her mother, who encouraged him to look her up. The pair exchanged the occasional letter while she was away overseas. When she returned, Arthur bought her a brush and comb as a Christmas gift in 1962, but she told him she had a boyfriend, and Arthur never pursued Jeanette any further. Upon reviewing crime scene photos, authorities determined that the shots were possibly fired through the windows in the kitchen which looked onto the lounge through a doorway. The windows were open that night, and it was theorized that Harvey was shot first in his armchair due to the brain tissue found on the chair. The killer then went into the house and encountered Jeanette, who was struck before being shot. She had a contact wound, implying the gun had been pressed up against her skin. Armed with this new information, another search of the garden was conducted in October 1970 and turned up a spent cartridge case, half buried in the ground. The weapon carried marks which showed it had been ejected from Arthur's rifle, and in November 1970, he was arrested and charged with the double homicide. Although his wife and cousin gave him strong alibis for the 17th of June, Arthur was put on trial. The prosecution suggested that it was his wife who was seen by the witness on the Crew property on the 19th, while the witness disputed this as he would have recognized her. They claimed that the motive behind the killing was that Arthur was obsessed with Jeanette, but almost every scrap of evidence that the prosecution had was circumstantial at best. Jeanette's father, Leonard, reportedly backed up the claims that Arthur was infatuated with his daughter, and in 1971, Arthur Allen Thomas was found guilty. A later appeal overturned this conviction, but he was tried and convicted again in 1973. Arthur's supporters began a campaign to bring attention to the miscarriage of justice which had occurred. Dr. Jim Sprott, an expert forensic scientist, was consulted, and he found that the cartridge of Arthur's that was found in the Crew garden had been planted. It was shown to be from a batch that couldn't have contained the bullets that had been found in the victims' bodies. In 1979, Arthur was released from prison and was paid almost $1 million for his time spent in jail and the loss of the use of his farm. The Royal Commission of Inquiry was ordered to review the case. They reported in November of 1980 that the bullet had been planted in the garden, having been created by the police when they had impounded his gun and ammunition. The report stated its belief that D.I. Bruce Hutton and D.S. Lemrick Johnston were responsible for the misconduct, but charges were never laid against the two. Among other things, the report acknowledged the planted evidence, but not that the police had been on the wrong track. It also ruled out Leonard Delmer as the killer, although he was the police's initial suspect. There are several main theories surrounding the murders of Harvey and Jeanette. The first is that a murder-suicide took place. Some believe that since Jeanette was physically struck in the face, Harvey was responsible, and either in self-defense or because she had perhaps snapped, Jeanette shot her husband. She then possibly had her father help her move and dispose of the body, but in the days following, Jeanette shot herself either due to guilt or because she knew she would get caught. Leonard then found her body and disposed of it as well. However, many believe Leonard, and Leonard alone, is responsible for the double homicide. In 1962, Leonard had been fined £10,000 for tax evasion, and to meet the liability he had to sell half of his share of the farm to his wife. At the time of Jeanette's death in 1970, she was about to receive that share, which had been left to her by her mother. Jeanette's sister, Heather, had been written out of her mother's will when she decided to marry a divorced American man. Leonard went on to raise suspicion during the investigation by the fact that he was slow to raise the alarm on his missing child and her husband, a scratch found on his neck, and that while he shadowed the authorities in their search for the missing couple, he didn't actively join in. He also made a comment that they would likely be in the water, which is where the pair were ultimately located. Leonard denied being involved. Reportedly, police were told that Leonard also had an unregistered .22 caliber gun, but it appears if this gun existed, it was never recovered. However, it was found that, financially, Leonard would not have gained anything. Although he would receive the couple's share in the farm, it would ultimately go to his granddaughter when she turned 21. It's also been speculated that the woman seen on the farm on the 19th was Leonard's new girlfriend. Many online sleuths believed that a man named Mickey Eyre was responsible for the killings. Mickey was a man with a disability which prevented him from speaking, and according to his mother, didn't go out at night. This, however, was disputed by many witnesses who said they had seen him out and about at night with a gun. Earlier in this episode, we spoke of how a .22 caliber rifle which belonged to the Ayer family could not be ruled out as being the murder weapon. Reportedly, Harvey had fought with Mickey Ayer over work that he had done on the Crew farm, and witnesses said that, in a rage, he'd thrown Mickey off his farm. This could possibly be a motive for Mickey Ayer. However, Mickey was never investigated or deemed as a person of interest. An official police review in 2014 said that available evidence was insufficient for a new prosecution. As far as the investigation is concerned, Leonard has been cleared as a suspect, but the murder of Harvey and Jeanette continues to go unsolved. The Sutton Bank body. August 28, 1981 was no ordinary day for police in North Yorkshire. On this morning, they received a phone call from an anonymous person described as being a well-spoken man and who gave chilling information about a dead body near Scorton Moor House. The man refused to identify himself for, quote, national security reasons, but nonetheless, police took his tip on board and headed out to scour an area of the North York Moors National Park in search for the body he had described. It didn't take long for authorities to make the grisly discovery. A female body was lying in the bushes near a country road around Sutton Bank. She was badly decomposed and located in a picnic area of the park that was regularly visited by couples and shooting parties. Police got their first clue when they discovered 3 sets of fresh tracks near to the body. It's suspected that someone had recently found or had been searching for the body, possibly the anonymous man on the other end of the phone line earlier that day. Beneath the body was a yogurt lid with an expiry date reading 1979. This indicated to police that perhaps Jane Doe had been lying there for 2 years. However, many online sleuths dispute this and argue that the lid could have been put there to throw authorities off. 3 months later, in November 1981, medical students collaborated with a TV makeup department to create a waxwork replica of Jane Doe's face in the hopes that someone, somewhere, would be able to identify the woman who had been carelessly dumped in August that same year. Unfortunately, these attempts at identifying Jane were unsuccessful. The Home Office recorded Jane's death as an unexplained incident in 1981. The state of decomposition of her body made it impossible to decipher her cause of death, and very little is known about who she might be. Jane Doe is described as being around 5'4" and aged around 40 years old. She had dark hair in a page boy style and was of a slender build. Jane had many telltale signs of old injuries: an old fracture on her right ankle, a deviated septum likely caused from trauma to the nose, and an abnormality in her neck vertebrae which would have caused her to suffer from a bad back. Jane Doe was missing all of her upper teeth and she had a dental plate fitting. She had only 6 of her lower teeth and they were heavily stained, suggesting she was a smoker and a drinker who did not take care of herself properly. She had pink Max Factor brand nail polish on her toes and wore a shoe size 4. Jane was found naked and with no other personal items or items of clothing. Several appeals for information in Jane's case were made over the years, and her body was exhumed in 2012, but, once again, no information was found that could lead to her identity or her killer, although a full DNA profile is now available for comparison. Theories on what happened to Jane Doe or who she is range from Jane being an escaped prisoner from the nearby Arkham Grange, or that she was a missing secretary from Hull, or a butcher's wife who vanished when she went to buy a new car. These three theories have all since been disproven, however. Many believe that the anonymous caller who led police to the body was somehow involved in the murder. However, there is no evidence that he is connected, and this theory is simply online speculation. Some sleuths also wonder if Jane was a victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter Sutcliffe was a married truck driver from Bradford who was convicted of killing 13 women and attempting to kill 7 more between 1975 and 1980. This latter theory has since been dismissed. Also known as the Nude in the Nettles, Jane Doe has remained unidentified for almost 40 years. Her case is still open, but police can only investigate so much when there are no new leads in the case. The Burton John Doe. On March 26, 1971, Special PC David Nathan was on his way to go out shooting when he made the gruesome discovery of a man's body. He stumbled over what he thought was a bag of cement, but after he looked, he realized it was, in fact, a corpse. Located on a river island in the village of Winchell near Burton-upon-Trent, the body was dubbed as Fred the Head by locals. The man had been buried in a kneeling position, his hands and ankles bound, and he was naked but for a pair of socks on his feet that were pinkish beige in colour, with mustard-coloured heels and toes. John Doe wore a lady's 9-carat gold wedding ring on his right ring finger, which was found to have been manufactured in 1967 to 1968 by Henry Shoal Limited. This is perhaps one of the only true clues authorities have in John's case, but unfortunately it has not narrowed down his possible identity any further. John Doe's body was in a severe state of decomposition. It's unclear when exactly John is estimated to have perished. Some sources believe it was several years, but more recently the UK Missing Persons Bureau claimed he'd been buried for around 9 to 12 months. The Burton John Doe is estimated to have been between the ages of 24 to 36 and had short brown hair that was no longer than 3 inches in length. He had undergone extensive dental work, and most notably, his lower jaw jutted out, and he was a sufferer of torticollis, a condition that meant his head would have leant to the right. Many hoped that these distinguishing features would have finally brought John Doe's true name to light, but this has not been the case. The closest authorities got to identifying John was in 2017, when police thought that perhaps John was a missing milkman named John Henry Jones, who disappeared in November of 1970. However, once the family came forward following a Crime Watch appeal, it was found that John Doe had no relation to John Henry Jones. A court reporter turned author, Michael Posner, proposed in his book Fred the Head and Other Unsolved Mysteries that John Doe was a missing father of 3 named Michael Edge. He went missing from Watford around the same time that Burton John Doe was discovered. It's unknown if police have considered this lead. It's widely believed by authorities that whoever dumped John Doe's body likely knew the area very well. Back in 1971, the area had only 2 routes into it. One entrance was across a gated and locked bridge, and the other was across Burton Bridge. But to get there in the first place, the killer would need to have followed a rough track and gone through fields. Given that neither path was well known, it seems likely that someone local was the perpetrator. Unfortunately, that is all available information on the Burton John Doe. He continues to remain unidentified, and his killer has escaped justice for almost 50 years. The Bedgebury Forest Jane Doe. On October 23, 1979, in Bedgebury Forest, Kent, a woman riding horseback through the trails was shocked to find the dead body of a woman lying in the brush. Jane Doe was found with no ID and has remained nameless for 4 long decades. Jane was found wearing black shoes, a black polo neck jumper, a yellow blouse, and a homemade black and white floral dress made from furniture fabric. She was described as having a thin build, standing approximately 5'1", and was possibly Eastern European. Her hair was brown and shoulder length, and her eyes were brown too. It's believed that she may have given birth to at least 1 child in her lifetime, and was thought to be between the ages of 30 to 35, but potentially as young as her mid-20s. Jane's cause of death was the result of a beating. She had suffered massive head injuries, and a blood-soaked wooden stake was found near to her body. Police identified this as the murder weapon. She had been dead for approximately 5 days. Her autopsy showed that Jane had suffered an ectopic pregnancy, which is when a fertilized egg implants itself outside of the womb. It's likely that Jane would have been in severe pain, and she may have sought out medical attention thinking she had appendicitis, as the pain would have been on her right side. Jane had poor dental hygiene. Her molars were worn down and her wisdom teeth were present. Her teeth had visibly decayed, although there was no signs that she was a smoker. Authorities suspect that Jane Doe was a hitchhiker with no permanent address who started out in North England. Many wonder if she was perhaps a sex worker who worked out of the Spitalfields market. An appeal was made for information on Jane's identity and killer via BBC's Crime Watch, once in 1984 and once again in 1999. The main lead in Jane Doe's case was her homemade, unique dress. The 1984 Crime Watch appeal asked for the dressmaker to come forward. The dress had been altered twice, once to the hem and once again to the chest area. In 1999, when the show appealed for information once again, it was announced that the dressmaker had come forward and said that the dress had been given to a charity shop in Worcestershire. Crime Watch presenters asked for the dress alterer to step forward, but nobody ever did. Jane Doe's case was closed at some point but reopened again in 1998. A lorry driver named Harry Pennells was charged with the murder in 2000 when he was 75 years old. Flecks of blood and flakes of hair were found in the cab of Harry's lorry and in a sleeping bag. Both had moderate support that the DNA was the victim's, and according to forensics, the particles on Jane's clothing matched a foam mattress which lay in the back of the lorry. The trial lasted 4 weeks, and the prosecution presented the theory that Harry, who was 54 years old at the time, had picked up Jane Doe whilst she was hitchhiking, before beating her to death with the wooden stake found next to her body in Bedgebury Forest. While Harry admitted to picking up a woman matching her description, he claimed that he dropped her off in South London on October 20th and denied any accusation of murder. Harry's defense produced a witness who saw a similar looking woman to Jane Doe in the forest on October 21st, the day after the CPS said that the murder took place. In the end, the jury found Harry Pennell not guilty. Outside of this trial, possible theories on what may have happened to Jane Doe are endless. It's possible she was murdered due to her pregnancy. Perhaps she was killed by an abusive partner or had engaged in an affair. Of course, if Jane really was a sex worker, this opens up the possibilities even more. Unfortunately, without an ID, it seems likely that Jane's case will never see a resolution. Andrew Godson. On the morning of September 14th, 2007, 14-year-old Andrew Godson left his home in Doncaster, UK, and headed for school as usual. But Andrew never reached school that day. Instead, he waited for his parents to go to work before returning home and changing out of his uniform. He then emptied his bank account that had £200 in it, and, without leaving a note, he caught a train from Doncaster Station to London, arriving at King's Cross Station at 11:20 a.m. This was the last sighting of Andrew, and no one has seen or heard from him since. Here we look at the background to the case, in the hope that perhaps one of the viewers of this video will recognise him. Andrew was born July 10th, 1993, to parents Kevin and Glenys. Andrew and his sister Charlotte were brought up in a Christian household, although their parents did not impose their views on their children, and as Andrew grew older, he no longer attended church with them. Andrew was a highly intelligent student who studied at the Macaulay Catholic High School in Balby, Doncaster, and he had been expected to score straight A's in his upcoming GCSE exams. Andrew was a quiet boy who enjoyed his own company, although he did have a group of like-minded school friends, although he rarely socialised with them and preferred to spend his time at home reading, gaming, and listening to music such as Slipknot, Muse, and Funeral for a Friend. At the time of his disappearance, there were no obvious signs of depression or mental instability. Andrew was 14 when he disappeared, but he was small for his age and looked more like a 12-year-old, and although he was very mature mentally, he was not streetwise. He wore strong prescription glasses and was deaf in one ear and has a very unique double ridge on the side of his right ear. Although his hair was light brown the day he disappeared, he intended to dye it black. He was last seen wearing a black Slipknot t-shirt, black jeans, a watch on his left wrist, and carrying a black canvas satchel with patches of rock and metal bands on it. In the days leading up to his disappearance, Godson started walking home from school rather than taking the bus, a journey that would take him around 1 hour, 20 minutes. But aside from that, his family said he seemed his usual self. The evening before he disappeared was spent with his family. They ate together, washed up, and watched TV. On the morning of September 14th, 2007, Andrew was described by his family as irritable and hard to wake. This was out of character for Andrew, who was normally an early riser. After he left the house to catch his bus to school, he diverted his route and waited in a local park until the rest of the household had left for the day. He was seen there by a family friend, sitting on a bench, and was later captured on a neighbour's CCTV system returning home. After changing out of his uniform, he put it in the washing machine. He then took his wallet, keys, PlayStation Portable console, and carried them in his bag. He did not take a coat or his passport and left £100 cash in his bedroom. Andrew left his house and walked to a cash machine at a local garage and withdrew £200 from his bank account. He used this to purchase a train ticket to London. This footage was captured on the morning of his disappearance. He then boarded the train alone, and CCTV picked him up at King's Cross Station at 11:25 a.m. on September 14th, 2007. This was the last confirmed sighting of Andrew. When the family sat down to eat that evening, they had no idea Andrew was missing. They assumed he was in his room, but alarm bells rang when they realised he wasn't. At around 7 p.m. that evening, the police were informed. A huge search was undertaken, but it turned up nothing, and it was 3 days before it was established he had bought a one-way train ticket to London. Initial thoughts were he had gone to stay with relatives in London, but again, this drew a blank. The family and the police investigated the possibility that Andrew had gone to London to meet someone whom he had met online. However, there was no evidence for this. Andrew did not use the computer at home and had no interest in social media, and there was no indication he had logged onto a school or library computer either. Another suggestion is Andrew travelled to London to see one of his favourite bands, 30 Seconds to Mars, as they were playing the Brixton Academy that evening. But despite appeals to fans who were at the gig, nothing has turned up. Over the years, there have been dozens of unconfirmed sightings of Andrew from across the UK, and a year after his disappearance, a man visited Leominster Police Station and told officers via intercom that he had information about Andrew. However, by the time someone had come to take his information, he had gone. Then, after the BBC featured the case on The One Show, the programme received an anonymous letter from someone claiming to be the man from Leominster Police Station. It said Andrew had been seen in Shrewsbury, but investigators have been unable to trace the man or find any evidence that Andrew is indeed in Shrewsbury. Every year, Andrew's family launch fresh appeals, and his case has appeared on many more popular TV and radio programmes across the UK, using age progression images of what he might look like as the years pass. They have also appealed to the gay community, as the family have considered the possibility that Andrew could have been struggling with his sexual orientation. In May 2011, the family paid a private company to conduct a sonar search of the River Thames, using the same technology that is used to locate victims and important items at sea. No trace of Andrew was found during the search, though it did uncover another body. In 2017, to mark the 10th anniversary of his disappearance, the charity Missing People made Andrew the face of their Find Every Child campaign, and his image featured on billboards and advertisements throughout the UK. The same year, it was announced that the police were launching a fresh appeal. In a statement, they revealed they would investigate requests for similar optical prescriptions to Andrew, documents from the Passport Office or National Insurance, and they would circulate Andrew's DNA, fingerprints, and dental and health records. The tone of the statement indicated the police believe Andrew is still alive. In 2018, the family got a breakthrough when they received a tip from someone who said he'd been talking to someone named Andy Rue online, who had been asking for money because his partner had walked out on him. The person offered to transfer him money, but was told he didn't have a bank account because he had left home when he was 14. It seized the family's interest because their nickname for Andrew as a kid was Rue. The tipster claimed Andrew was living in Lincoln, although so far they haven't been able to get any further information. Andrew's family continue to launch appeals for information. They firmly believe Andrew is still alive and cling to the hope that he might one day walk through their front door using the key he had with him when he left. This year, 2020, Andrew will be 27. If you are Andrew, or you have any information about him, or need help of any kind with regard to a missing person, either yourself or someone you know, don't hesitate to phone 116-000 at any time of day inside the UK. There is always help out there. Angela Hammond. On April 4th, 1991, at around 9 p.m, 20-year-old Angela Hammond dropped off her fiancé Rob Schaefer at his mother's house. The couple had spent the evening together at a barbecue, but Rob had to babysit his younger brother until his mother returned from work, and the pair planned to meet up again later. Angela was 4 months pregnant at the time, and her and Rob were planning to be married. Both the Schaefers and the Hammonds families were eagerly awaiting the marriage and the birth of their new grandbaby. Life for the couple was looking well. As Angela left and Rob waved goodbye on the doorstep, she promised to call him later. In the interim, Angela spent time with her best friend, Kayla. At approximately 11 p.m, Angela and Kayla parted ways for the night, and as she had promised, Angela phoned her fiancé from a payphone on the corner of 2010 South 2nd Street, where the Food Barn store parking lot was situated. Nowadays, a lone female in a payphone in a deserted parking lot at 11 p.m. at night would be unheard of. But things were different in the small, rural town of Clinton, Missouri. The small community was close-knit, mostly made up of farmers, factory workers, or small business owners, so Angela would have felt safe in a place where violent crime was unheard of. As Angela chatted with Rob on the phone, she mentioned that a strange truck kept circling around the square. It was a late 60s, early 70s model Ford F-150. As a native of Clinton, Angela was familiar with most of the vehicles that usually cruised the square, but didn't recognize this one. However, she thought little of it and continued her conversation with Rob. Angela was getting tired and told Rob she was going to go home instead of waiting around for him to pick her up. Moments later, the man from the circling truck stopped and got out to use the phone box next to Angela. She went on to describe the man to Rob and said he was a dirty-looking old white man with a white beard and mustache. Angela was relieved when he left the phone box and returned to his truck, but became nervous when he didn't drive off. Suddenly, the man returned, and the next thing Rob heard was Angela screaming. In a desperate panic, Rob drops the phone and runs out to his car and drives at speed the 7 blocks to the parking lot. As he approaches it, the old Ford pickup passes him on the road, with Angela screaming inside. Rob immediately shoves his car into reverse and spins around in the road to give chase, but the mover destroys his car's transmission, and about 2 miles into the chase, his car dies and he is helpless as he watches his fiancée disappear down a dark, rural lane. Rob makes his way back to the police station and reports what happened. Initially, Rob was the main suspect, but after a week-long investigation, he was cleared. This wasted valuable time. Checks were run on all the trucks that fit the description Rob had given, but it turned up nothing. There was one distinguishing feature of the truck. It had an image on the back glass that featured a fish jumping out of the water. Rob also gave the details to the police sketch artist about the truck's driver. This is where things begin to differ from Angela's description over the phone. He didn't see a white man with a white beard and mustache. This discrepancy is potentially what caused some people to suspect Rob, but investigators were satisfied he wasn't involved, and it is possible the beard Angela described was fake, and it fell off in the struggle to bundle her into the truck. An extensive search and investigation was carried out by both the police and the community, but it found nothing. Initially, Angela's abduction was linked to 2 similar disappearances that had occurred within an 80-mile radius months earlier in January and February of 1991. That of Trudy Darby and Cheryl Ann Kenny. Trudy was subsequently found murdered, but Cheryl's disappearance is still unsolved. Trudy was murdered and kidnapped by 15-year-old Jesse Ruesch and his half-brother Marvin Cheney, and in letters Jesse Ruesch wrote that he alluded to the fact that him and Marvin had done the same to other women, although nothing was ever proved. Angela's case also featured on the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, and a reenactment of her disappearance was created, but produced no further leads. Angela's mother Marcia even appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show to highlight the plight of her missing daughter, but again, no new information came forward. Nearly 30 years on, it is a complete mystery what happened to Angela. No trace of her has ever been found. She was alive the last time Rob had seen her, and although unlikely, it is still possible she is still alive somewhere and gave birth to the baby she was expecting. For Rob, he not only lost his future wife, but also his future child. As with every case we highlight, if you have any information on the disappearance of Angela Hammond, please contact the Clinton Police Department at 600-885-2679. Keith Reinhard. This mystery doesn't begin with Keith Reinhard. It starts with Tom Young. Tom ran a bookshop on Main Street in Silver Plume, Colorado, in the heart of the Rocky Mountains. On September 7th, 1987, Tom closed up his shop and along with his dog Gus, he disappeared. Tom had previously told people he was taking a vacation to Europe, and so it was 3 weeks before anyone reported him missing. A few months after Tom went missing, 49-year-old Keith Reinhard, a sports writer for the Chicago Daily Herald, had grown dissatisfied and restless with his life and decided to take a 90-day leave of absence and move to Silver Plume, leaving his wife Carolyn in Chicago. Keith's longtime friend Ted Parker already lived there, and Keith envied his rustic, uncomplicated lifestyle. Keith intended to open an antique shop, write a book, and find himself. Coincidentally, Ted Parker owned the storefront that was previously let to Tom Young and re-let it to his friend Keith. Keith arrived in Silver Plume in June 1988 and set up his antique shop. But he soon found that there was not much of a market for antiques in the sleepy, somewhat run-down area of the Rockies, and the drudgery of running a shop bored him. However, since moving to Silver Plume, Keith had become obsessed by the unexplained disappearance of the former keeper of the shop and began talking to everyone in the small community who had known Tom, and decided to base the novel he intended to write on his disappearance. The character he created for his novel was called Guy Gypsum, and was a composite of himself and Tom. Then, on July 31st, 1988, just a month after Keith had arrived in Silver Plume, 2 hunters found the remains of Tom and Gus in the nearby mountains. Both had died from a bullet wound to the head. Laying near the remains was a revolver. Investigations later revealed Tom had purchased the gun 4 days before he was last seen in Silver Plume. The case was open and shut, and ruled as a suicide, although some had their doubts about this verdict, including Keith. On August 7th, a week after Tom's remains were found, Keith announced to friends that he was heading into the mountains for a brief hike up Mount Pendleton. He was last seen wearing casual clothing and trainers. The alarm was raised after Keith failed to return at 10 p.m. as scheduled. His disappearance led to one of the biggest searches in Colorado history. The search was called off on August 14th, after a plane involved with the search crashed, killing one and injuring another. But by then, it had logged more than 10,000 man-hours and hadn't found a single clue. Over 30 years later, Keith's son Kai Reinhard still searches for the truth about what happened to his father. He doesn't believe his dad's disappearance and Tom's death are a coincidence. He believes foul play is involved, and that maybe his father stumbled across something about Tom's death during his research. Kai doesn't believe his father would have just left with no note or contact. However, his best friend Ted Parker felt then and now that Keith simply fell and his remains are still lost to the mountain. Speculation about Keith's vanishing has varied from a planned disappearance or suicide to something more sinister, and for now, the case is still open. A plaque has been placed on the mountain where Keith disappeared by his son Kai. It is inscribed with his father's words written when he was just a boy. It reads, "Oh God, I want to wander. I want to wander till I die. With the mountains as my living room, my only roof, the sky." The words are quite prophetic, and tragically it seems, may have come true. Anyone with any information regarding this case is asked to please contact the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office. Jonathan Luna. Born October 21st, 1965, Jonathan Paul Luna was a married father of 2 who'd grown up in the South Bronx in New York City. After studying at the University of North Carolina School of Law, he went on to several high-profile jobs before eventually securing a place as an assistant U.S. attorney in Baltimore. On the evening of December 4th, 2003, Jonathan had been pulling a late shift at the Baltimore courthouse as he prepared for a case the following morning that involved him prosecuting 2 defendants in a drug conspiracy trial. He phoned a co-worker around 9 p.m, letting them know he'd be leaving soon to go and continue with his work at home. He had also called the defense attorney earlier that night, telling him he'd fax over documents, but he never did. Despite telling his colleague he was leaving soon, Jonathan didn't actually exit the building until 11:38 p.m. Oddly, he had left his glasses, which he needed to drive, and his mobile phone on his desk. He drove northeast on the I-95 and passed several toll booths, 3 to be precise. He used his Easy Pass to get through them. However, after this, he switched to purchasing toll tickets. At 12:57 a.m, $200 was withdrawn from Jonathan's bank account from an ATM machine at JFK Plaza Service Center near Newark, Delaware. After this, Jonathan's electronic fingerprint shows him at 2:47 a.m. as he crossed the Delaware River toll bridge, and about half an hour later, activity on his debit card showed that he purchased gas at the King of Prussia Service Plaza. The last journey that Jonathan made was at 4:04 a.m. when his car exited the turnpike at the Reading-Lancaster interchange. A spot of blood was noticed on his toll booth ticket, and it was speculated that the 38-year-old had already been injured. At 5:30 a.m, Jonathan's car was found parked at 1439 Dry Tavern Road in Denver, Pennsylvania. A passerby noticed the car with its lights off and its front end in a creek. Blood was smeared on the driver's door and on the left section of the car, whilst Jonathan was face down in the stream under the car engine. He still wore his suit and black overcoat, and his court ID was hanging around his neck. As authorities were called in and the gruesome scene of the death was investigated, more troubling information was found. There was a pool of blood in the car on the rear seat floor, and it was found that Jonathan Luna had been stabbed 36 times with his own pocket knife, with the wounds concentrated around his neck and chest. He had also incurred a head injury, although his final cause of death was ruled by several coroners as homicide by drowning. Despite the words of several experienced coroners, the FBI, who also looked into the case, determined that Jonathan had died by suicide, and, strangely, they pushed for the medical examiners and the Lancaster County authorities to concur with this statement. The FBI argued that the wounds on Jonathan's hands were shallow and looked like hesitation wounds that one would find on the body of a suicide victim. They claimed he did not have substantial defense wounds. They suggest a motive for taking his own life centered around the fact that $36,000 had gone missing from a bank robbery case he had prosecuted, and that Jonathan was going to be facing a polygraph test in relation to this. They also said it was possible he had attempted to stage an abduction and attack to excuse him from inquiries or perhaps garner sympathy from investigators. However, local authorities and coroners dismissed these attempts at smearing Jonathan's name. One of the coroners in the case said that Jonathan's hands had been shredded by self-defense wounds, and any shallow wounds he'd received were likened to torture. Jonathan's throat had been slashed, and he had sustained wounds on his back. The blood in the back seat of the car suggested to police that he had been in the rear, while somebody else was driving the vehicle. A second blood type was found in the car, as well as partial prints which did not belong to Jonathan. These have both yet to be linked to anyone, as suspects and motives in the case remain hard to determine. Grainy CCTV footage from near the time of the gas station purchase made with Jonathan's credit card was recovered, but doesn't seem to have provided any new leads. He was not seen on the camera, but several workers came forward to claim that they had seen him that night, and he had appeared calm. The $200 that had been withdrawn littered his car in bills. Rumours swirled as the peculiar case of Jonathan Luna hit the headlines, many of which disparaged the lawyer's reputation. Whispers began that he had a poor relationship with his boss and was on the verge of being fired, while another US attorney clarified that Jonathan's job was not at risk. There also appeared to be no solid evidence to corroborate the claims that he was involved in the missing $36,000. One odd detail that emerged was that Jonathan's name had been used on either a dating website or to solicit sex from prostitutes, but there isn't any evidence to support whether Jonathan himself did such a thing or if someone simply used the name. The 38-year-old had also racked up $25,000 in debts, $17,000 worth of which was on credit cards that his wife alleged she did not know about. There is currently a reward offered of $100,000 for any information leading to a conviction in this case. But, as of 2020, the case of Jonathan Luna is still open and unsolved. Morris Davis Jr. In Great Falls, Montana, on April 5, 1985, at around 11 p.m, paramedics were called to the scene of a multiple shooting inside of a home. Upon entering, one of the paramedics, Cliff Davies, found his 23-year-old brother. Morris Vernon Davis Jr. had been shot more than 8 times and was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. It appeared that the motive for murder had been robbery, as the killer had taken Morris's delivery wallet and nothing else. The wallet contained less than $300. 4 months before the murder, Morris had taken up a part-time pizza delivery driver job. He was the next available driver the night he was killed, meaning that it was unlikely he had been specifically targeted. The telephone order was made to Howard's Pizza at 8:43 p.m, and at 9:15 p.m, Morris left with the food. When he did not return back to his place of work, another driver was sent to check on him, discovering the grim murder scene. Police found that the local home was actually vacant and that the for sale sign at the front of the house had been removed. The back door had been forced open, allowing the killer access to the building. Since there was no phone service in the house, it was likely that the call made to place the order for pizza was done so from a nearby payphone. Authorities theorized that Morris had been killed upon entering the house, but no suspects could be determined until 3 years later. On May the 11th, 1988, in a town 180 miles from Great Falls, a man was arrested for driving a car stolen from Oregon 3 days prior. When the unidentified thief was searched, it was found that he had 2 receipts from a pawn shop, with one being a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber that murdered Morris Davis Jr. 3 years earlier. After locating the weapon at the pawn shop, authorities discovered that the pistol had also been reported stolen 3 days earlier. Extensive ballistic testing carried out on the gun showed that it was the murder weapon in the case of the pizza delivery driver in 1985. According to the unidentified man who had possession of the gun, he had stolen it from a friend several days prior to his arrest, and he denied any involvement in the murder of Morris Davis Jr. Not only this, but the real owner of the gun, who went by Rick in articles of the time, also claimed he knew nothing about the murder, and that he had an alibi in the form of him being at home on the night of the crime, looking after his son. He told police that only he and his wife knew where the gun was kept, and investigators struggled to understand how someone could possibly know where the gun was, take it, and then return it without its owners being any the wiser. Upon investigating the alibi and the background of Rick, police deemed him not a suspect in the 1985 murder. The only other lead in the case comes from Morris's brother, Cliff, one of the paramedics who was called into the scene of the shooting. Cliff initially believed that Rick knew who was responsible, but in October of 1995, more advanced ballistic testing was carried out on the pistol, and it was determined that it was not the murder weapon after all. Cliff then came to believe that the prime suspect in the murder of his brother was a man called Donald DeBray. DeBray had been convicted of the 1986 murder of a convenience store clerk who was working the night shift, Suzanne Pritchard. She had been shot 24 times and robbed of $300. Like the murder of Morris, the act seemed to be violent and excessive, especially for a fairly small amount of cash. Cliff contacted DeBray several times about the murder of his brother. He alleged that DeBray had a very specific knowledge about the house where the crime took place, where shots were fired from, and where the body was found, amongst other things. DeBray reportedly claimed that he was in the house at the time of the murder, but did not pull the trigger. After this information came to light, police made DeBray a prime suspect in the case, but he died in prison in 2016 and never confessed to the murder of Morris, despite detectives' attempts to try and gain closure for the Davis family. As of 2020, the murder of Morris Davis Jr. remains unsolved. Rose Burkett and Roger Atkinson. On September 12, 1980, Rose Burkett, a 22-year-old single mother working as a trainee nurse, and Roger Atkinson, a 32-year-old telephone installer repairman, attempted to check into a Manor Holiday Inn near Williamsburg, Iowa. Due to a convention that was on, there were no vacancies available, and they were turned away. A cancellation came up later in the day, and the pair were fortunate enough to be able to book the room. Nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary with the couple. They did not make a fuss or draw attention to themselves during their stay. However, at noon the next day, when the housekeeping was doing their rounds, something seemed amiss. The pair did not respond to knocks on the door or requests for the maid to be allowed inside. Suspicious, the maid let herself in with the master key and saw the feet of the couple on the bed. Assuming they were asleep, she peered in further, only to be met with a bloodbath of a crime scene. Both Rose and Roger were dead on the bed of their hotel room. They had sustained fatal head injuries, and Roger's fingers were severed from trying to defend himself from the attack. The huge blood loss and brain trauma endured by both parties were labelled as the cause of their death, with authorities determining that the wounds were made with either an axe or a hatchet. Rose was fully dressed, whilst Roger wore only shorts. The TV was still on in the room, and, oddly, 2 chairs had been pulled up next to the bed, leading authorities to wonder if the couple had some kind of conversation with the killer. This, coupled with the fact that there was no sign of forced entry, brought about the speculation that the pair knew their murderer. Further evidence in the room showed that the killer had put his feet upon the desk and carved a bar of soap, using it to write this on a bathroom mirror. A strange clue that has brought no new leads to the case. Over 400 people were interviewed by authorities, including staff and guests at the inn. However, it seems more likely that someone closer to home was involved. A likely suspect in the case was Rose's ex-boyfriend, whom she had kicked out of her home for his drug use. She'd recently taken out a personal protection order against this unidentified man, and bought a dog for protection. One day, when she returned home from work though, she found her dog had been brutally slaughtered and hung up in her front yard. Investigators did look into Rose's ex-boyfriend, but found that his alibi checked out. He also seemed to pass a polygraph test, although this is known to not be foolproof as a method of proving someone's innocence. Another suspect in the double murder was Roger's uncle, Charles Ray Hatcher, who was a serial killer. He had escaped from a mental facility in September of 1980, but was later apprehended again. However, he was never questioned about the crime concerning his nephew. According to an article in the local paper in September 1980, agents from Missouri and Illinois were brought in to assist with investigating the case, and they were looking into a similar murder committed less than 3 months prior, on June 25th, where a hatchet was used in the crime. Unfortunately, Roger's father died in 2004, and his mother followed him 8 years later. Neither found justice for their son. One of Rose's closest friends, Tammy Berkman, works to keep the case alive, even though it cost her her own marriage. As of 2020, the case of Rose and Roger remains unsolved. Joanne Elizabeth Bertha Shippen. Joanne Elizabeth Bertha Shippen was born in January of 1888 and died at the young age of 13. Bertha was the youngest child in a large family that lived in the South Australian town of Tawita, a small German farming settlement. On January 1st, 1902, Bertha's parents left for the day to go and visit family at Eden Valley, 12 miles away. That night, her 2 younger brothers slept in the nearby barn, leaving just Bertha and her 24-year-old sister Mary alone together in the family's modest cottage. According to Mary, at 10 p.m. that night, she woke to find a bearded man lying across her chest. After a short struggle, she broke free and escaped the house, leaving her little sister behind. One of her younger brothers notified the local constable, but when they returned, Bertha was found dead. She had been brutally stabbed approximately 40 times. The inquest into the 13-year-old's grisly murder was headed by the local coroner, Dr. Ramsey Smith, and was held shortly after the discovery of her body. There was much suspicion surrounding Mary, given that she was the only witness to the bearded man and the only one in the house at the time with Bertha. Not only this, but there was no evidence the man had been in the house, or had even existed. An extensive police search turned up no leads to the identity of the man or clues that he had been in the home. This led to Mary being charged. Her trial began in March of 1902. Mary was smart, hiring the best lawyer in the state, who successfully convinced the jury that the evidence against his client was circumstantial at best. The jury took 2 hours to return with their verdict, and Mary was ultimately acquitted of the murder of her sister. However, Mary was not the only suspect in Bertha's case. Local media speculated that their father was responsible for the crime due to his well-known history of violence. Others suggested that Mary's 21-year-old boyfriend, Gustav Nischke, was responsible. The couple had been dating for a year. Mary's father, Mattis Shippen, had once fired shots at Gustav, wounding him and leaving him pulling pellets from his leg. He had supposedly also murdered a travelling trader, and Bertha had witnessed this. The supposed motive Mattis had for murdering his daughter is that she had threatened to tell authorities what she knew regarding this homicide. Gustav had an alibi for the night Bertha was killed, but it was suspected that if he or Mary had killed the 13-year-old, it was because she may have threatened to expose the couple's relationship to her strict father. Meanwhile, it has been argued that Mattis couldn't have possibly made the 20-kilometer trip home from Eden Valley, as it was dark out and the terrain was unpredictable. After her acquittal, Mary lived her life as a recluse and never married. She was known as the Grey Lady, as she wore a grey-coloured dress and bonnet and often wandered about, not looking at anyone. She passed away in 1919, age 41, after suffering with tuberculosis. The murder of her sister, Bertha, continues to go unsolved over a century later. The Pisenhall murder. The Providence House in the village of Peasenhall, Suffolk, became the backdrop to one of England's most cold-blooded murders when, in 1902, a young woman named Rose Harsant was brutally stabbed and left for dead. She was just 22 years old and 6 months pregnant at the time of her murder. On May 31st of that year, Rose Harsant, a servant girl at the Providence House, had received an anonymous letter asking her to meet at 12 a.m. Rose went, but she would never return. Her father, William, went to the Providence House the following morning. He found the home still and quiet as he made his way through it. As he came into the kitchen, he stumbled across the bloodied body of his daughter lying on the kitchen floor. The end of Rose's life had been a violent one. Her throat had been slit, gashes were found in her shoulders and chest, her face and jaw were bruised, and she had wounds on her hands that suggested she'd tried to fight off her attacker. The girl's nightdress was charred. At first, authorities thought she'd either taken her own life or the whole thing had been an accident, that she'd fallen downstairs and cut herself on the broken oil lamp, which in turn had ignited her nightgown. However, after investigating Rose's room, they came across the anonymous letter, and they also caught wind of rumours that suggested Rose had been involved with a married man. The man in question was a clergyman in his 30s named William Gardiner, who lived with his wife and 6 children. He was an elder and choir master at Rose's church. Reportedly, locals had been well aware of the couple's affair, which had begun in 1901, as they had been overheard in an empty chapel having discussions that were sexual in nature. Immediately, authorities homed in on William. There was certainly much evidence in the case that pointed towards the clergyman. A broken medicine bottle containing paraffin was found near Rose's body. It had been prescribed to one of the Gardiner children. The handwriting on the anonymous letter was thought to be a match to William's, and the police located a bloody knife in his home, although he claimed that the blood was rabbit, not human. Neighbours also witnessed a fire in William's garden after the murder had taken place, which many feel explains why bloody clothing was never found in his possession. However, there was one hurdle for the prosecution. Mrs. Gardiner backed up her husband's alibi, claiming the pair of them were in bed together all night. When confronted by police, she admitted that she knew of the rumours circulating around the village about her husband and Rose, but added that they were complete and utter rubbish, and that William had been cleared by an inquiry carried out by the chapel. It was discovered that Mrs. Gardiner had been awake in the early hours of the morning. Her neighbours had heard her awake through the paper-thin walls. They heard her retire to bed around 4 a.m. The estimated time of Rose's death was between 2 and 4 a.m. This has led many to believe that Mrs. Gardiner was the real killer, who carried out the brutal slaying in a fit of rage and jealousy, and was perhaps triggered upon finding out that Rose was pregnant. Eventually, William was charged, and he faced 2 trials, one in November of 1902 and one in January of 1903. Both trials used the same prosecutor, Henry Dickens, son of renowned author Charles Dickens, and the same defence. Both times, William maintained his innocence, and both times the jury could not agree on a verdict, resulting in a mistrial. While William was scheduled for a 3rd trial in 1903, those heading the case thought it was useless to do so, that they would face the same outcome, and so the clergyman was released. He was never formally acquitted, since he was neither found guilty nor innocent, and many locals continued to suspect him once the trials were over. Upon his release, the Gardiner family moved to London for a fresh start. William died in 1941, and the family of Rose Harsant never received justice in their daughter's murder case. The Linz Green Railway Station murder. The Lints Green Railway Station was on the Derwent Valley Railway branch of the North Eastern Railway, County Durham, England. The station opened on December 2nd, 1867. It was known to be extremely isolated, as only a handful of houses were near the station and not much else. On the night of Saturday, October 7th, 1911, 60-year-old station master Joseph Wilson was shot when returning home after closing his office at the station. Joseph was a widower and known as a quiet, respectable man who had lived a clean, simple life. He also had a keen interest in horticulture. He was the last person anyone would want to hurt, or so those who knew him thought. Although Joseph did not die instantly, he was unable to name his killer. According to reports, sand had been thrown in his face before he was shot dead. The remaining colleague of Joseph's, a man named Fred White, was in the middle of locking the booking office when he heard the gunfire. Accompanied by his friend, the two hurriedly made their way to where they believed the shot had come from. Bertha Wilson, Joseph's daughter, called out from her house, shouting that they had shot her father, who had collapsed on the porch. 4 passengers from the last train that had arrived had also heard the gunshots. They too made their way towards the station master's house, following the sound of the gunfire. Joseph was carried into the home, and one of the men, a trained and skilled ambulance man, loosened Joseph's tie and gave him a sip of brandy, asking who shot him. Joseph could not answer, gurgling before passing away. The motive behind Joseph's senseless murder was believed to be robbery. He had a habit of carrying the day's takings to his house, 50 yards away, but on the day in question, he had transported the cash earlier on. The hunt for Joseph's killer became one of the largest in the history of the Northeast, with 200 officers utilized in the investigation, but nobody has ever been convicted for the crime. The doctor who conducted Joseph's post-mortem concluded that he had been killed by a single bullet from a large caliber revolver. The bullet was found by police along with a small bag containing sand. Footprints in the garden were also uncovered, as was a piece of linen cloth shaped in the form of a gag. Since the surrounding area was filled with brushwood and trees, it was suspected that the culprit had managed to escape on foot, disappearing amongst the shrubbery. The prime suspect in the slaying was 25-year-old relief porter Samuel Atkinson, and he was questioned heavily. 3 out of 4 witnesses identified him as having been hanging around the station long after he claimed to have gone home. The 4th witness was unsure, but felt it was possible Samuel was the man he had seen. Samuel was charged with the murder of Joseph Wilson. However, his attorney found out that Samuel had not been cautioned during his investigation, and thus any statements made by him relating to his whereabouts or the evening in question were not admissible in court. Due to this blunder, law enforcement's main evidence against Atkinson could not be used in his trial, and so there was insufficient evidence to charge him with the crime. Ultimately, Samuel was released. His attorney had requested that his client be monetarily compensated since he had endured much distress. This plea was, however, rejected. Samuel's case was dismissed, and after this, police ended their investigations. As a result, the case remains unsolved, and Joseph's family never received justice for his murder.